Welcome to Whispered Empires, where we explore the darkness and light that shaped our world. Tonight, we descend into humanity's greatest catastrophe, World War II, a conflict so vast it touched every continent, killed over 70 million people, and forever altered what it means to be human. Before we journey into this abyss, please subscribe to this channel and press the bell icon to join us for future explorations through history's deepest mysteries. And if these stories move you, leave a like so others might find their way here. Now, let us begin our descent into the war that nearly consumed civilization itself. The war did not begin in 1939. It began in the ashes of the First War, in the humiliations written into treaties, in the economic chaos that followed, in the millions of dead whose sacrifice seemed to purchase nothing lasting. The peace of 1919 was a false peace, a temporary exhaustion mistaken for resolution. Beneath the surface, resentments festered like infected wounds. In Germany, the myth spread that the nation had been stabbed in the back, that the army had not truly lost but been betrayed. This lie, nurtured in beer halls and political rallies, would grow into something monstrous. The seeds of the Second War were planted in the soil of the First. The 1920s brought fragile prosperity to some, but the foundation was unstable, built on credit, speculation, and unresolved structural problems. When the American stock market collapsed in October 1929, the shockwaves spread globally. Banks failed. Factories closed. Unemployment soared into double digits across the industrialized world. In Germany, where economy had barely recovered from wartime destruction and hyperinflation, the Depression struck with particular cruelty. 6 million unemployed Germans wandered streets where bread lines stretched around blocks. Desperate people sought desperate solutions. Democracy, associated with economic catastrophe, lost legitimacy. Extremism, communist on the left, fascist on the right, gained adherents who saw no future in the moderate center's failures. In this chaos, Adolf Hitler found his moment. An Austrian corporal from the Great War, he possessed gifts as an orator that could transform crowds, speaking to their fears and resentments, promising restoration of national pride, scapegoating Jews and communists for Germany's troubles. His National Socialist Party, the Nazis, grew from fringe movement to political force. In January 1933, aged 43, Hitler became chancellor through constitutional processes, then systematically dismantled democracy from within. Within months, opposition parties were banned, labor unions destroyed, press censored. Jews faced escalating persecution, boycotts, dismissals from professions, Nuremberg laws stripping citizenship. Germany transformed into totalitarian state where one party, one leader controlled everything. The world watched with unease but took no action. Hitler was not Europe's only dictator. Benito Mussolini had seized power in Italy in 1922, creating the fascist model Hitler would adapt. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin ruled through terror, purging millions of perceived enemies, collectivizing agriculture at cost of famine killing millions, building an industrial war machine through slave labor. In Japan, military officers assassinated moderate politicians, establishing control over government, embarking on imperial expansion in Asia, occupying Manchuria in 1931, invading China in 1937. Across the globe, democracy retreated. Authoritarian regimes promising order, strength, and national glory rose. The interwar period's democratic experiment seemed to be failing. Liberalism appeared weak, indecisive. Dictatorship appeared strong, purposeful. History was moving in dangerous directions. Hitler violated the Versailles Treaty systematically, testing how far he could push before democracies responded. In 1935, he announced Germany's rearmament, openly building an air force and army that the treaty had forbidden. The democracies protested but did nothing. In 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland, remilitarizing territory that was supposed to remain demilitarized. France could have stopped this easily. The German army was still weak, but France did not act. Hitler later admitted that if France had resisted, German forces would have retreated in humiliation. But France, haunted by memories of trenches and casualties, would not risk war. Hitler learned that democracies would accept violations rather than fight. Each successful challenge emboldened him further. Appeasement, the policy of making concessions to avoid war, only made war more likely. In March 1938, German troops crossed into Austria, annexing Hitler's homeland into the Reich. Austrians welcomed them with cheering crowds, flowers, Nazi salutes. The Anschluss violated treaties but brought no military response. 6 months later, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, the German-speaking border region of Czechoslovakia. War seemed imminent. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich to negotiate, meeting Hitler, Mussolini, and French Premier Daladier. Without Czech representation, they agreed to German annexation of the Sudetenland in exchange for Hitler's promise to seek no further territorial gains. Chamberlain returned to London proclaiming, "Peace for our time." Crowds cheered him. The alternative, war, seemed unthinkable. But Hitler's promise was worthless. Within 6 months, Germany occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. The policy of appeasement lay in ruins. On August 23, 1939, the world learned that Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, ideological enemies who had spent years denouncing each other, had signed a non-aggression pact. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact stunned observers, but its secret protocols revealed the truth. Hitler and Stalin had agreed to divide Eastern Europe between them. Poland would be carved up, the Baltic states absorbed by Soviet Union, spheres of influence delineated. Both dictators understood this was temporary. Eventually they would fight each other, but for now the pact served both. Hitler was freed from the nightmare of two-front war that had doomed Germany in 1914. Stalin bought time to prepare for inevitable conflict. The democracies realized too late that appeasement had failed catastrophically. War was no longer avoidable. It was imminent. At dawn on September 1, 1939, German forces invaded Poland from the west. 57 divisions, over 1.5 million men supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, smashed across the border in what would be called Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Stuka dive bombers screamed down on Polish positions. Panzer tanks swept around resistance rather than confronting it directly. Mobile infantry followed, exploiting breakthroughs. Traditional cavalry charges met machine guns and tanks, resulting in slaughter reminiscent of the previous war but more decisive. Poland's forces fought courageously, but were overwhelmed by speed, coordination, and firepower. On September 17, Soviet forces invaded from the east per the secret protocol. Poland faced enemies on all sides. By early October, Polish organized resistance had collapsed. The nation was partitioned between Germany and Soviet Union. World War II had begun. Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3, honoring commitments to Poland, but they could not save Poland. The French army sat behind the Maginot Line, a system of elaborate fortifications along the German border, waiting defensively. The British Expeditionary Force crossed the Channel to positions in Belgium, but neither launched serious offensive to relieve pressure on Poland. This period, autumn 1939 through spring 1940, became known as the Phony War or Sitzkrieg. Except for naval actions and the Soviet invasion of Finland in November, little fighting occurred in the West. Both sides prepared, mobilized, trained. Civilians wondered if real war would ever come or if this was another Munich-style resolution in progress. They would not wonder long. Hitler was planning operations that would shock the world and redraw Europe's map in weeks. On April 9, 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway simultaneously, demonstrating that Blitzkrieg could be adapted for amphibious operations. Denmark fell in hours, its resistance hopeless. Norway fought longer with British and French assistance, but German air power and audacious airborne operations secured key positions. By June, Germany controlled Scandinavia, securing Swedish iron ore supplies and gaining naval bases threatening Atlantic convoys. But Norway was merely prelude. The main blow would fall on France. On May 10, 1940, German forces attacked Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Allied forces, believing this was the main attack as in 1914, rushed forward into Belgium. But this was faint. The real German thrust came through the Ardennes forest, terrain considered impassable for tanks. Panzer divisions emerged from the forest behind Allied lines, cutting off armies that had rushed forward. It was a masterpiece of operational planning, and it would destroy France. The Battle of France unfolded with stunning speed. German armored spearheads raced to the Channel coast, splitting Allied forces, trapping British and French divisions in northern France. The Maginot Line, which had consumed vast resources, was bypassed, irrelevant. Allied command structure proved too slow and rigid to respond to German mobility. On May 26, surrounded British and French forces began evacuating from Dunkirk. For 9 days, every available British vessel, naval ships, fishing boats, pleasure craft, crossed the Channel to rescue troops from beaches under constant air attack. Over 330,000 men were evacuated. A logistical miracle but strategic disaster. Equipment, vehicles, tanks, artillery, all were abandoned. France stood alone. German forces turned south. On June 14, they entered Paris unopposed. On June 22, France signed armistice in the same railway car where Germany had surrendered in 1918. In 6 weeks, Germany had accomplished what 4 years of trench warfare could not achieve in the previous war. France, the great military power, had fallen. Britain faced Germany alone. Winston Churchill, who had replaced Chamberlain as Prime Minister in May, refused to contemplate peace negotiations despite Britain's isolation. In speeches that became legendary, he rallied the nation. "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." Hitler expected Britain to negotiate, but Churchill would not. Hitler planned Operation Sea Lion, invasion across the Channel, but first Germany needed air superiority. In July 1940, the Luftwaffe began attacking British shipping, ports, airfields, attempting to destroy the Royal Air Force. The Battle of Britain had begun. For months, German and British fighters dueled in skies over southern England. Radar gave British defenders crucial advantage in detecting incoming raids. Spitfires and Hurricanes rose to intercept bomber formations. German losses mounted. Hitler postponed, then cancelled the invasion. Britain had survived. Unable to invade, Germany turned to strategic bombing. The Blitz, sustained bombing campaign against British cities, began September 7, 1940. London suffered 57 consecutive nights of bombing. Coventry, Liverpool, Birmingham, Glasgow, other industrial centers were targeted. Civilians sheltered in underground stations, basements, Anderson shelters in back gardens. Tens of thousands were killed, entire neighborhoods obliterated. But British morale did not break. Production continued. The government did not collapse. Hitler learned what others would learn. Strategic bombing could devastate cities but could not defeat determined nations. Meanwhile, the war spread. Italy, seeking glory, invaded Greece in October 1940, but Greek forces counterattacked successfully, humiliating Mussolini. In North Africa, British forces routed much larger Italian armies in Libya, taking over 130,000 prisoners. Italy, the weakest Axis partner, required constant German rescue operations. The war was becoming truly global. In June 1941, Hitler made the decision that would ultimately doom the Third Reich. Despite the non-aggression pact, despite warnings from his generals, despite ongoing war with Britain, Hitler ordered Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. His ideology demanded it. Nazism was fundamentally anti-communist, viewed Slavs as inferior, sought living space in the East. And he believed Soviet military had been gutted by Stalin's purges, that the campaign would be over in months. On June 22, 3.5 million German soldiers attacked across an 1,800-mile front from the Baltic to the Black Sea. It was the largest invasion in history. Soviet forces were caught completely by surprise despite numerous warnings Stalin had ignored. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands surrendered. German forces advanced hundreds of miles in weeks. By autumn, Leningrad was besieged, Moscow threatened, Ukraine occupied. Victory seemed within grasp. But Russia was not Poland or France. Distances were vast. Roads were poor. Supply lines stretched impossibly. Soviet forces, though suffering catastrophic losses, did not collapse. Stalin, recovering from shock, rallied the nation with appeals to Russian patriotism rather than communist ideology. The Soviet system's brutal centralization allowed rapid mobilization. Factories were evacuated east of the Urals, beyond German reach, continuing production. And most critically, winter was approaching. German forces, expecting quick victory, lacked winter clothing and equipment. In December 1941, temperatures dropped to -40 degrees. Weapons froze. Vehicles would not start. Soldiers suffered frostbite, hypothermia. Soviet forces, equipped for winter, counterattacked around Moscow with fresh divisions from Siberia. German forces fell back, suffering their first major defeat. The Blitzkrieg had failed. The war in the East would become a grinding, brutal campaign of attrition that would consume armies and nations. On December 7, 1941, while Germany struggled in Russian snow, Japanese carrier aircraft attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack came without warning. Diplomats were still negotiating in Washington when the bombs fell. 8 American battleships were sunk or damaged. Over 2,400 Americans died. President Franklin Roosevelt called it a date which will live in infamy. The next day, America declared war on Japan. On December 11th, Hitler declared war on America, an act of staggering strategic stupidity. Germany was not obligated to do so by treaty with Japan, and America's industrial might would prove decisive. But Hitler believed America, with its democratic politics and diverse population, would be weak. He was catastrophically wrong. The war was now truly global: Europe, Asia, Africa, the Atlantic, the Pacific. Every continent except Antarctica would see fighting. And America's entry meant the Allies gained resources that would ultimately overwhelm the Axis. But Allied victory was not yet inevitable. In early 1942, Axis powers appeared ascendant. Japan swept through Southeast Asia, Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Dutch East Indies, Burma. British forces surrendered Singapore, supposedly impregnable fortress with 80,000 troops, the largest capitulation in British military history. Japanese forces advanced toward India and Australia. In North Africa, German General Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps drove British forces back into Egypt, threatening Suez Canal. German U-boats hunted Allied convoys in the Atlantic, sinking ships faster than they could be replaced. In Russia, German forces recovered from winter setbacks and launched summer offensives toward Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields. The tide had not yet turned. Dark days lay ahead for the Allies, months when defeat seemed possible, when each battle carried existential weight. But slowly, imperceptibly at first, the balance was shifting. The turning point came not in one battle, but in a series across 1942 to 43. In the Pacific, American carriers defeated Japanese carriers at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, sinking 4 carriers and turning the tide of the Pacific War. In North Africa, British 8th Army under Montgomery defeated Rommel at El Alamein in October-November 1942, beginning the drive that would clear Axis forces from Africa. In November 1942, American and British forces landed in French North Africa in Operation Torch, opening a new front. But the greatest battle raged at Stalingrad, where German 6th Army and Soviet forces fought for every building, every floor, every room in the ruined city. From August 1942 through February 1943, the battle consumed over 2 million casualties. In November, Soviet forces encircled the Germans. In February, the survivors surrendered, over 90,000 soldiers, including a field marshal. It was Germany's first army-level defeat, a disaster from which German fortunes never recovered. The tide had turned, irreversibly. As Allied forces gained momentum, another story was unfolding in occupied Europe, one so dark that even now it challenges comprehension. The Holocaust, the systematic murder of European Jews, accelerated from persecution to genocide. Millions were herded into ghettos where disease and starvation killed thousands. Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, followed German armies into Soviet territory, massacring Jews, Roma, communists, intellectuals in mass shootings. At Babi Yar ravine near Kiev, over 33,000 Jews were shot in 2 days. But bullets were inefficient. The Nazis sought industrial methods. They built death camps in occupied Poland. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek. Jews from across Europe were transported in cattle cars to these facilities and murdered in gas chambers disguised as showers. Bodies were burned in crematoria or buried in mass graves. By war's end, approximately 6 million Jews would be murdered, two-thirds of European Jewry. The Holocaust represented industrial civilization turned toward extermination, humanity's capacity for evil expressed through bureaucracy, logistics, and technology. Understanding it remains impossible. Confronting it remains necessary. While death camps operated, resistance movements fought in occupied territories. In France, the resistance sabotaged rail lines, passed intelligence to allies, assassinated collaborators. In Yugoslavia, partisans under Tito tied down dozens of Axis divisions. In Poland, the Home Army prepared for uprising. In occupied Soviet territories, partisans ambushed German columns, blew up bridges, disrupted supply lines. Resistance was dangerous. Captured fighters faced torture and execution. Civilians in areas where resistance operated faced collective punishment, but continued nonetheless. Ordinary people chose to resist despite terrible odds, believing some things worse than death. Their sabotage degraded German military effectiveness. Their courage inspired others. But resistance came with cost measured in villages burned, hostages shot, families destroyed. There were no clean hands in this war, only gradations of darkness. Yet in that darkness, some chose to hold candles, however small, against the night. By 1943, Allied strategy took clearer form. America and Britain agreed on Germany first, defeating Nazi Germany before concentrating fully on Japan. But they disagreed on approach. Stalin demanded a second front in France to relieve pressure on Soviet forces bearing the war's brunt. Churchill preferred attacking through the Mediterranean, soft underbelly of Europe. America wanted direct assault across the Channel. As compromise, they invaded Sicily in July 1943, then mainland Italy in September. Italy's fascist government collapsed. Mussolini was deposed and arrested, later rescued by German commandos and installed as puppet. But Italy did not mean easy fighting. German forces occupied the country, establishing defensive lines across mountains. Allied advance up the Italian peninsula became grinding attrition reminiscent of the previous war. Slow, costly, achieving little strategic benefit. Meanwhile, in the Atlantic, the tide turned against U-boats. Better tactics, escort carriers, long-range patrol aircraft, breaking German codes, all contributed to defeating the submarine threat by mid-1943. The seas were becoming safer for the buildup necessary for the great invasion everyone knew was coming. The assault on France. On the Eastern Front, the largest tank battle in history erupted at Kursk in July 1943. German forces attacked a Soviet salient from north and south, attempting to encircle Soviet forces as in previous summers. But Soviet intelligence knew the attack was coming. Defenses were prepared, minefields, anti-tank ditches, artillery concentrations, reserves positioned for counterattack. Over 6,000 tanks and 2 million soldiers fought across a front hundreds of miles wide. German armor pushed forward but could not break through. Soviet forces absorbed the attacks, then counterattacked, driving Germans back. After Kursk, Germany never again launched major offensive on the Eastern Front. Soviet forces advanced steadily westward, liberating occupied territories at terrible cost. By early 1944, Leningrad's 900-day siege was lifted. Ukraine was liberated. Soviet forces approached Poland. The Red Army was coming, an avenging force determined to reach Berlin whatever the cost. Germany now fought desperately to delay inevitable, hoping some miracle might save the Reich. In the Pacific, American forces island-hopped toward Japan, bypassing heavily fortified positions, capturing islands for airfields and bases. Each island, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, cost thousands of casualties against fanatical Japanese defense. Japanese soldiers fought nearly to the last man, rarely surrendering, often launching banzai charges or committing suicide rather than face capture. Kamikaze pilots deliberately crashed aircraft into American ships, sacrificing themselves to damage the enemy. American forces responded with overwhelming firepower: naval bombardment, aerial bombing, flamethrowers against bunkers and caves. The fighting was brutal, primitive despite modern weapons. In the Philippines, American forces returned under General MacArthur, who had famously promised, "I shall return," after evacuation in 1942. Japanese occupation had been cruel. Filipino guerrillas aided American liberation. By early 1945, Philippines were largely secure. American bombers could now reach Japanese home islands. The war was approaching Japan itself. But the Japanese government showed no sign of surrendering despite clearly losing. More bloodshed was inevitable. June 6, 1944, D-Day, the invasion of Nazi-occupied France began before dawn. Over 150,000 Allied troops crossed the English Channel to Normandy beaches. Paratroopers and glider infantry landed inland to secure flanks and sow confusion. At 6:30 a.m., the first waves hit beaches codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. Most beaches saw successful landings despite casualties. But at Omaha Beach, American forces faced disaster. German defenses on bluffs overlooked the beach. Machine guns enfiladed the entire landing zone. Men died in water before reaching sand. Those who reached beach found themselves pinned, unable to advance. For hours, Omaha hung in balance. Small groups of soldiers, often led by junior officers and NCOs, improvised assaults up the bluffs, taking out German positions. Slowly, desperately, American forces clawed their way off the beach. By nightfall, the beachhead was secure but costly, over 2,400 American casualties at Omaha alone. Still, the invasion succeeded. Allied forces were ashore in France. Hitler's Atlantic Wall had been breached. The liberation of Europe had begun. Progress from Normandy was slower than hoped. The hedgerow country of Normandy, small fields surrounded by dense vegetation and earthen banks, proved ideal for defense. German forces contested every field. Allied casualties mounted alarmingly, but weight of numbers and material gradually told. American forces broke out at the end of July, sweeping into Brittany and toward Paris. On August 25, Paris was liberated, Free French forces entering first to symbolize France's liberation by French forces. General de Gaulle entered the city to jubilant crowds. Meanwhile, in southern France, Allied forces landed in Operation Dragoon, advancing up the Rhône Valley. German forces in France were collapsing. By September, Allied forces had liberated France and Belgium, crossing into Germany itself. Victory seemed near. Perhaps the war would end in 1944. But a bridge too far at Arnhem, supply difficulties, stiffening German resistance, and winter's approach slowed the advance. The war would continue into 1945, and Germany had one more surprise offensive planned. On December 16, 1944, German forces launched a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes, the same route they'd used in 1940. The Battle of the Bulge, as it became known, achieved complete surprise. American lines were thinly held. Defenders were inexperienced or exhausted veteran units resting. German panzers broke through, driving west toward Antwerp, attempting to split Allied armies. In fog and snow, confusion reigned. Some American units were overrun. One surrendered en masse. At Malmedy, SS troops massacred American prisoners. But at critical road junctions, American forces held out. At Bastogne, surrounded American paratroopers refused German surrender, demands with a one-word reply: nuts. Weather cleared, allowing Allied aircraft to attack German columns. By January, the offensive had failed. Germany had expended its last reserves, lost hundreds of tanks and aircraft it couldn't replace, delayed the inevitable by weeks. The Bulge was pushed back. Allied forces resumed their advance toward the Rhine and the heart of Germany. In the east, Soviet forces launched massive winter offensives in January 1945, advancing into Poland and East Prussia. German defenses collapsed under the weight of Soviet artillery, tanks, infantry. German civilians fled west ahead of the Red Army, having heard stories of Soviet revenge for German atrocities in Russia. Those who remained often faced brutality, rape, murder, looting, as Soviet soldiers took vengeance. By February, Soviet forces reached the Oder River, just 40 miles from Berlin. In the west, Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March after the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was captured intact. American and British forces raced across Germany, meeting token resistance from units that preferred to surrender to Western allies rather than Soviets. German cities fell one by one: Cologne, Frankfurt, Nuremberg, Munich. In the north, British forces advanced into northern Germany and Denmark. From east and west, Allied forces converged on Berlin. The Third Reich, which Hitler proclaimed would last 1,000 years, was in its death throes after 12. But those death throes would be violent and destructive. As Allied forces advanced, they discovered the death camps. Soldiers who had seen combat's horrors were shocked by what they found. At Majdanek, liberated by Soviets in July 1944, the gas chambers and crematoria remained intact, providing evidence of industrial murder. At Bergen-Belsen, liberated by British in April 1945, thousands of corpses lay unburied. Survivors were living skeletons. Disease was rampant. At Buchenwald, liberated by Americans in April, prisoners were emaciated, tortured, worked to death. At Dachau, American soldiers were so enraged by what they saw that some executed SS guards on the spot. And at Auschwitz, liberated by Soviets in January, the evidence was overwhelming. Gas chambers, crematoria, warehouses full of victims' belongings, survivors bearing tattoos identifying them as numbered prisoners. The Holocaust moved from rumor and incomplete intelligence to documented reality. Eisenhower ordered German civilians to tour the camps, to see what had been done in their name. The world confronted evil that seemed beyond human capacity yet was undeniably human in origin. The Battle of Berlin began on April 16, 1945. 2.5 million Soviet troops, 6,250 tanks, 7,500 aircraft attacked from the east. German defenders numbered perhaps 1 million, including old men of the Volkssturm militia, Hitler youth boys as young as 12, remnants of SS units. They fought desperately, knowing surrender to Soviets meant uncertain fate. The battle was savage, fought floor by floor, room by room through the capital's ruins. Soviet artillery pulverized buildings. Tanks fired point-blank into structures. Casualties mounted into tens of thousands. Hitler, in his underground bunker, issued orders to non-existent armies, demanded counterattacks that never came, raged against betrayal. On April 30th, with Soviet forces blocks away, Hitler married his mistress Eva Braun, dictated his political testament blaming Jews for the war, then shot himself. Braun took poison. Their bodies were burned in the Chancellery Garden. On May 2nd, Berlin's garrison surrendered. On May 7th, Germany signed unconditional surrender at Eisenhower's headquarters. May 8th was proclaimed victory in Europe Day V-Day. After nearly 6 years, the war in Europe was over. But the war continued in the Pacific. Japan fought on despite hopeless strategic position. By summer 1945, American submarines had destroyed Japanese merchant fleet, cutting the home islands from resources. American bombers firebombed Japanese cities, killing hundreds of thousands. Tokyo raid of March 9th to 10th, 1945, killed over 100,000 in a single night. Yet Japanese government would not surrender. Military leaders spoke of Ketsugo, decisive battle, to be fought on Japan's home islands, mobilizing entire population, inflicting such casualties that America would negotiate rather than demand unconditional surrender. American planners anticipated Operation Downfall, invasion of Japan, would cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties and millions of Japanese deaths. Both sides prepared for Armageddon. But American scientists had been working since 1942 on the Manhattan Project, developing atomic weapons. By July 1945, they had succeeded. The first atomic bomb was tested at Alamogordo, New Mexico, on July 16th. It worked, producing an explosion equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. Humanity had gained power to destroy itself. The question was whether to use it. President Truman, who had succeeded Roosevelt after his death in April, faced the decision. Use atomic bombs on Japan, potentially ending the war without invasion and saving Allied lives, but killing tens of thousands of Japanese civilians instantly. Or invade conventionally, accepting massive casualties on both sides. Truman chose the bomb. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb nicknamed Little Boy on Hiroshima. The bomb detonated 1,900 feet above the city at 8:15 a.m. Everything within a mile of the blast was vaporized. Fires ignited across 5 square miles. Approximately 70,000 people died instantly. Thousands more would die from radiation sickness. Japan did not immediately surrender. On August 9, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki, killing approximately 40,000. That same day, Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. Facing atomic annihilation and Soviet invasion, Emperor Hirohito intervened personally, deciding to accept Allied surrender terms. On August 15, his voice was broadcast to Japan, the first time most Japanese had heard their emperor speak, announcing surrender. On September 2, 1945, aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japan signed the instrument of surrender. World War II was over. The war's cost defied comprehension. Approximately 70 to 85 million people died, about 3% of the world's 1940 population. Soviet Union suffered the most, 27 million dead, nearly half of all war deaths. China lost 15 to 20 million. Germany lost 7 to 9 million. Poland lost 6 million, 17% of its pre-war population, including 3 million Jews. Japan lost 3 million. Yugoslavia lost 1 million. The numbers became abstractions. The individual tragedies were infinite. Every number represented a person. Their dreams, relationships, potential futures, snuffed out. The destruction of infrastructure, cities, industries, cultural heritage sites, and artwork was incalculable. European and Asian cities lay in ruins. Economies were shattered. Millions were displaced, refugees wandering bombed-out landscapes. The world had nearly destroyed itself. And yet, somehow it had to rebuild to find meaning to ensure this never happened again. In the war's aftermath, the United Nations was established, replacing the failed League of Nations. The Charter, signed in San Francisco in June 1945, committed member nations to maintaining international peace and security, to resolving disputes peacefully, to respecting human rights. Unlike the League, the UN included all major powers, including Soviet Union, and gave permanent Security Council seats to victors, each with veto power. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, proclaimed fundamental rights inherent to all human beings, written partly in response to Holocaust's horrors. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted Nazi leaders for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the newly defined crime of aggressive war. 24 major Nazi figures were tried. 12 were sentenced to death. Similar trials occurred in Tokyo for Japanese leaders. International law evolved to hold individuals accountable for atrocities, establishing precedents still relevant today. The war fundamentally reshaped global power. Europe, dominant for centuries, was exhausted, dependent on American aid. The Marshall Plan poured billions into European reconstruction, rebuilding economies, preventing communist revolutions. Two superpowers emerged, United States and Soviet Union. Wartime alliance quickly dissolved into Cold War hostility. Germany was divided into occupation zones that became two separate states. Europe was divided by what Churchill called an Iron Curtain between Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe and democratic Western Europe. The nuclear age had begun. Both superpowers developed ever more powerful weapons, creating balance of terror that prevented direct war but spawned proxy conflicts worldwide. Colonial empires collapsed. Britain, France, Netherlands, Belgium could no longer maintain overseas territories. Independence movements, strengthened by wartime rhetoric about fighting for freedom, demanded liberation. India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Algeria, and dozens of other colonies gained independence in coming decades. World War II destroyed the old world order. What replaced it remained uncertain, dangerous, pregnant with potential for disaster or progress. The Holocaust's revelation forced confrontation with questions about human nature, civilization's fragility, evil's banality. How could educated, cultured Germans, the nation of Beethoven and Goethe, become perpetrators or complicit bystanders to genocide? Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil suggested that ordinary people, following orders, conforming to authority, could commit extraordinary atrocities. The Holocaust demonstrated that industrial civilization's tools, bureaucracy, technology, logistics, could serve extermination as efficiently as production. It showed that thin veneer of civilization could shatter, that atavistic hatreds could be mobilized by demagogues, that prejudice could escalate to genocide if unchecked. The phrase "never again" became rallying cry, though subsequent genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and elsewhere proved it an aspiration not yet reality. The Holocaust remains unique in its systematic, industrial nature, but it revealed possibilities within humanity that remain terrifying, requiring eternal vigilance against prejudice, authoritarianism, dehumanization of others. Japan's reconstruction was rapid, transforming from militarist empire to pacifist democracy under American occupation. The emperor was retained but stripped of divine status, reduced to constitutional figurehead. A new constitution renounced war, prohibited military forces beyond self-defense. War crimes trials executed militarist leaders, including Prime Minister Tojo. American occupation introduced democratic reforms, land redistribution, labor rights, women's suffrage. Japanese society, disciplined and cohesive, rebuilt with remarkable speed. By the 1960s, Japan was an economic powerhouse. But the war's memory remained contested. Textbooks downplayed Japanese atrocities, the rape of Nanking, comfort women, brutal treatment of prisoners and occupied populations. Visits by leaders to Yasukuni Shrine, which honors war dead including convicted war criminals, provoked regional tensions. Japan's relationship with its past remained complex, torn between acknowledging victims and honoring those who fought, between pacifism and nationalism, between apology and pride. The atomic bomb's legacy transformed international relations and human consciousness. For the first time, humanity possessed means to extinguish itself. Nuclear weapons proliferated. Soviet Union tested its first bomb in 1949, Britain in 1952, France in 1960, China in 1964. The arms race produced bombs thousands of times more powerful than Hiroshima's. By the 1960s, both superpowers possessed enough weapons to destroy civilization multiple times over. The concept of overkill. Nuclear war became existential threat, anxiety pervading Cold War decades. Civil defense programs, fallout shelters, duck and cover drills reminded everyone that annihilation was one bad decision away. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought the world to the brink, demonstrating how close nuclear war could come. Ultimately, fear of mutual assured destruction, MAD, prevented use of nuclear weapons. But their existence cast shadow over everything, a sword of Damocles hanging over humanity. Some argued nuclear weapons prevented World War III through deterrence. Others argued they merely delayed inevitable catastrophe. The debate continues. The war's technological legacy included jet aircraft, rockets, radar, computers, antibiotics, synthetic materials, and countless other innovations. Wartime research and development accelerated peacetime progress by decades. Jet engines developed for fighters became basis for commercial jet travel. Rocket technology developed for V-2 missiles evolved into space programs. Radar became air traffic control. Code-breaking computers like Colossus and ENIAC pioneered computing revolution. Penicillin mass production saved countless lives. The war demonstrated that mobilizing scientific and industrial resources could achieve seemingly impossible feats. Manhattan Project took atomic physics from theoretical possibility to deployable weapon in 3 years. After the war, governments and industries invested heavily in research and development, creating military-industrial academic complexes that drove innovation. The relationship between military necessity and technological progress troubling yet undeniable, shaped the post-war world. The war's art, literature, and film grappled with its meanings. Novelists like Norman Mailer, James Jones, Kurt Vonnegut, Joseph Heller explored combat's reality and absurdity. Primo Levi and Elie Wiesel wrote Holocaust memoirs of devastating power. Films ranged from triumphalist celebrations like The Longest Day to anti-war meditations like Come and See. Later years brought more nuanced examinations. Schindler's List, Saving Private Ryan, Das Boot, acknowledging complexity, heroism, and horror coexisting. Monuments and memorials dotted landscapes, from the Soviet war memorials dominating Eastern European cities to the understated Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, from Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem to Hiroshima Peace Memorial. Each nation remembered differently, emphasizing aspects that fit national narratives, sometimes obscuring uncomfortable truths. Memory remained contested political terrain. Wars of memory fought long after shooting stopped. Veterans' experiences varied enormously. Some adjusted successfully, using benefits like the GI Bill to pursue education, start businesses, raise families. Others struggled with physical wounds, psychological trauma, survivor guilt, inability to communicate what they'd experienced. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not yet well understood. Treatment was primitive or non-existent. Many self-medicated with alcohol, withdrew from society, suffered in silence. Veterans' organizations provided community and advocacy. In some countries, veterans were honored as heroes. In others, returning soldiers faced indifference or hostility. Soviet veterans who had been prisoners of war faced suspicion of collaboration, sometimes imprisonment. Japanese veterans returned to defeated, occupied nations struggling with shame and loss. American veterans benefited from victory's glow but still faced individual struggles. Decades later, veterans were dying, their stories disappearing. Efforts to record oral histories intensified, preserving memories before they were lost forever. The question of whether the war was inevitable or preventable remains debated. Could different decisions in 1919 have prevented Nazi rise? If Versailles Treaty had been less harsh or more harsh, occupying Germany permanently, would Hitler have come to power? If democracies had confronted Hitler earlier, militarily opposing Rhineland remilitarization or Sudetenland annexation, would deterrence have worked, or merely started the war earlier? If appeasement had continued, would Hitler have eventually been satisfied, or would his demands have escalated indefinitely? These counterfactuals are unanswerable but important, because they relate to broader questions about historical causation, human agency, whether catastrophes are inevitable results of structural factors or contingent outcomes of decisions that could have been different. Perhaps the war emerged from complex interaction of long-term trends, nationalism, economic instability, unresolved World War I issues, and short-term contingencies, personalities, miscalculations, accidents. Understanding causes might help prevent future wars, or reveal that some dynamics exceed human control. Women's roles expanded dramatically during the war, with millions working in factories, serving in military auxiliaries, resistance movements, nursing, and other capacities. Rosie the Riveter symbolized American women in defense industries. Soviet women served as pilots, snipers, tank commanders in combat roles. British women operated anti-aircraft guns, drove ambulances, decoded intelligence. After the war, many women were pressured to return to domestic roles, but as with World War I, the experience could not be erased. Women had proven capabilities in all fields, challenging gender norms. Post-war decades saw gradual expansion of women's rights, education, career opportunities. The war accelerated social changes already underway, though progress was uneven and faced resistance. The greatest generation included women whose contributions were often overlooked in initial histories focused on male combat. But later scholarship recovered their stories, acknowledging their essential roles. The war's children, those who grew up during conflict years, formed a generation marked by deprivation, trauma, displacement, loss. Many lost parents. Malnutrition affected physical development. Education was disrupted. Children experienced bombing, occupation, evacuation, combat. Some became orphans. Jewish children who survived the Holocaust often lost entire families. After the war, displaced children wandered Europe. Organizations attempted to reunite families, place orphans, provide care. The psychological effects lasted lifetimes. Many carried trauma silently, unable or unwilling to discuss experiences. Others became determined to build a better world, motivated by memories of war's horrors. The war children generation shaped post-war societies, their attitudes formed by childhood in apocalyptic times. Their grandchildren now seek their stories before they're lost, recognizing these memories as precious, fragile links to history's darkest period. The war's economic consequences were profound and lasting. Europe and Asia's industrial capacity was devastated. Reconstruction required decades and massive investment, primarily American through the Marshall Plan in Europe and occupation aid in Japan. The dollar became world's reserve currency, American economic dominance unchallenged. Bretton Woods system established in 1944 created International Monetary Fund and World Bank, international economic institutions promoting stability and development. Trade barriers erected during Depression were gradually reduced through GATT negotiations, promoting international commerce. Keynesian economics emphasizing government intervention to maintain employment and demand became dominant policy framework in Western democracies. The post-war decades saw unprecedented economic growth, the golden age of capitalism, raising living standards, expanding middle classes, funding welfare states. But this prosperity was not universal. Developing nations struggled, Cold War divisions prevented global economic integration, inequalities persisted. Still, the war's destruction paradoxically created conditions for reconstruction and growth that benefited millions. The war's strategic bombing campaigns raised ethical questions still debated. Allied bombing of German and Japanese cities killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. Dresden firebombing in February 1945 killed 25,000 in one night, incinerating a historic city of questionable military value. Tokyo firebombing killed over 100,000. Were these attacks militarily necessary or war crimes? Advocates argued that area bombing attacked war industries, undermined morale, and shortened the war, ultimately saving lives. Critics argued that bombing civilians violated just war principles, that it was ineffective at reducing military production or breaking morale, that it constituted terrorism. The atomic bombs intensified debate. Were they justified to avoid invasion casualties? Or were they unnecessary given Japan's impending collapse, possibly motivated by desire to intimidate Soviet Union? These questions lack definitive answers. They force confrontation with war's moral complexity, with tensions between military necessity and humanitarian principles, with the uncomfortable truth that the good war against fascism involved actions that in other contexts would be condemned as atrocities. Resistance movements demonstrated human capacity for courage under impossible circumstances. French resistance, Yugoslav partisans, Polish Home Army, Dutch, Danish, Norwegian underground, Italian partisans, Soviet partisans behind German lines, all risked death to fight occupation. Resistance took many forms: armed sabotage, intelligence gathering, helping Allied escapees, rescuing Jews, underground press, symbolic acts defying occupiers. Resistors were ordinary people, teachers, farmers, workers, students who chose danger over collaboration. When caught, they faced torture, execution, their families sometimes killed in reprisal. Yet they continued. Resistance was not universal. Collaboration was common, motivated by ideology, opportunism, or simply survival. Occupied societies showed full spectrum of human response to evil. Active resistance, passive resistance, accommodation, collaboration, participation in atrocities. After liberation, resistance credentials were sometimes exaggerated, collaboration downplayed, creating mythologies that obscured reality's complexity. But the genuine resistors deserve remembrance. They proved that even in totalitarianism's heart, individuals could choose to resist. The war's intelligence operations involved code-breaking, espionage, deception that significantly affected outcomes. Breaking German Enigma and Japanese codes provided Allies crucial intelligence throughout the war. Bletchley Park's codebreakers, including Alan Turing, gave Allied commanders ability to read enemy communications, helping win Battle of the Atlantic, Desert War, and numerous other campaigns. Double-cross system turned German spies in Britain, feeding misinformation that supported D-Day deception plan, convincing Germans the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. Soviet espionage penetrated Manhattan Project, accelerating Soviet bomb development. Intelligence work was painstaking, often tedious, rarely glamorous despite later portrayals. But information advantage proved decisive. Wartime intelligence agencies expanded after the war, creating permanent establishments that shaped Cold War espionage, covert operations, surveillance. The war demonstrated that information was strategic resource as vital as material, establishing patterns that dominate contemporary warfare and geopolitics. The Pacific War's racial dimensions added particular brutality. Japanese propaganda portrayed conflict as race war, Asian liberation from Western imperialism. American propaganda dehumanized Japanese as subhuman, vermin to be exterminated. Atrocities occurred on both sides. Japanese mistreatment of prisoners and civilians was systematic and brutal. American forces sometimes took no prisoners, collected Japanese body parts as souvenirs. Japanese belief in Bushido code and emperor worship produced soldiers willing to die but not surrender. American forces adapted with tactics emphasizing firepower over maneuver, killing rather than capturing. The war in Pacific lacked Western Front's periods of relative restraint, rules honored even in violation. It was more total, more savage, more racially charged. Post-war reconciliation between America and Japan was remarkable given this history, suggesting that even bitter enemies can forge new relationships, though the wounds and resentments never fully heal. The war's navies fought across all oceans in surface battles, submarine warfare, carrier operations, and amphibious assaults. Naval warfare was transformed by aircraft carriers replacing battleships as capital ships. Battles like Coral Sea and Midway were fought by aircraft. The opposing fleets never sighted each other. Submarines, German U-boats in Atlantic, American submarines in Pacific, targeted merchant shipping, attempting to strangle enemy economies. Convoy systems, anti-submarine warfare, escort carriers gradually defeated submarine threat. Amphibious operations reached unprecedented scale, landings in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, southern France, and countless Pacific islands required coordination of naval, air, and ground forces. Naval power enabled Allied victory, moving armies across oceans, supporting them with bombardment, interdicting enemy logistics. Post-war, American naval dominance was unchallenged, projecting power globally through carrier battle groups. Soviet Navy expanded to challenge this, creating Cold War naval competition. The war demonstrated that modern warfare required integrated operations across air, sea, and land domains. War correspondents and photographers documented the conflict, shaping public understanding. Ernie Pyle wrote about ordinary soldiers' experiences with empathy and honesty, making readers feel combat's reality. He was killed by Japanese machine gun fire on IE Shima in April 1945. Robert Capa photographed D-Day landings, his blurred, chaotic images capturing the terror of Omaha Beach. Margaret Burke White documented war from multiple theaters. Edward R. Murrow's radio broadcasts from London during the Blitz brought the war into American homes. Bill Mauldin's cartoons about Willie and Joe, exhausted infantrymen, captured soldiers' attitudes with humor and truth. Correspondents operated under censorship but still conveyed war's reality more effectively than propaganda. After the war, their work became historical record, preserving images and testimonies that written histories could not capture. Combat photography and journalism established forms still used today, creating expectations that war should be documented, witnessed, that public has right to see what is done in their name. Medical advances during the war saved countless lives and revolutionized healthcare. Penicillin, discovered before the war, was mass-produced and widely used for first time, preventing infection deaths. Blood transfusion and blood banking became routine. Surgical techniques advanced rapidly. Treatment of burns, traumatic injuries, psychiatric casualties improved. Mobile hospitals near front lines, air evacuation of wounded, triage systems, all saved lives. But casualties overwhelmed medical capacity, especially in early years. Wounded often waited hours or days for treatment. Amputations were common. Many injuries left permanent disabilities. Medical personnel, doctors, nurses, medics, worked under extreme conditions, performing surgery under bombardment, treating hundreds of casualties after battles, dealing with horrors that exceeded training. Post-war, military medicine's advances benefited civilian healthcare. Veterans' medical care needs drove research into prosthetics, rehabilitation, trauma surgery, psychiatric treatment. The war accelerated medical progress, but at cost of millions of casualties who served as tragic subjects. The home fronts experienced total war's demands. Rationing, conscription, propaganda, mobilization, censorship, fear. Cities were bombed. Women worked in factories. Children were evacuated. Everyone contributed, collecting scrap metal, buying war bonds, conserving resources, volunteering. Governments controlled economies, directing production, setting prices, rationing food, clothing, fuel. Civil liberties were restricted, censorship, internment of suspect populations, Japanese Americans, ethnic Germans in allied nations, suppression of dissent. Propaganda shaped public opinion, maintaining morale, demonizing enemies, encouraging sacrifice. Life was regimented, controlled, focused singularly on winning. The distinction between combatant and civilian eroded as cities became targets, as entire populations became war resources. Post-war, returning to normal proved difficult. Wartime controls were gradually lifted, but some changes proved permanent. The war had demonstrated what governments could achieve mobilizing fully, establishing precedents for state intervention that shaped post-war politics. Logistics won the war as much as combat did. Supplying millions of soldiers across multiple continents and oceans required unprecedented organization. America's industrial capacity proved decisive, producing ships, aircraft, tanks, vehicles, weapons, ammunition, food, medical supplies in quantities Axis couldn't match. Liberty ships were mass-produced, replacing losses to U-boats faster than submarines could sink them. American factories produced 300,000 aircraft, 89,000 tanks, 3 million trucks. Lend-Lease supplied allies with $50 billion in material. Soviet Union received 400,000 trucks, 14,000 aircraft, huge quantities of food, enabling offensives deep into Europe. Britain depended on Atlantic convoys. Moving this material to where needed required vast logistical networks, ports, railroads, trucks, supply depots, repair facilities. Armies advanced or retreated based on logistics as much as combat. Patton's advance across France stopped not because of German resistance but because he ran out of fuel. Amateurs talk strategy. Professionals talk logistics proved true. Victory required not just brave soldiers but effective supply chains. The war's air forces evolved from supporting ground forces to independent strategic arms. Fighters gained speed, maneuverability, firepower. P-51 Mustang, Spitfire, FW-190, 0 representing peak of piston-engine fighter design. Bombers grew larger. B-17 Lancaster, B-29, capable of carrying tons of bombs thousands of miles. Close air support tactics developed, coordinating aircraft with ground forces. Strategic bombing campaigns targeted industry and cities, attempting to win through air power alone. Results were mixed. German war production continued increasing into 1944 despite bombing. Civilian morale didn't break, but bombing diverted resources to defense, destroyed transportation networks, killed hundreds of thousands. Air power advocates claimed vindication. Critics pointed to cost and questionable effectiveness. Post-war, air power's importance was undeniable. Jet aircraft, developed late in war, rendered piston aircraft obsolete almost immediately. The war proved that controlling airspace was prerequisite for modern operations, establishing air power as independent domain of warfare, not merely supporting other arms. Special operations forces emerged, conducting raids, sabotage, reconnaissance, guerrilla warfare behind enemy lines. British commandos, American Rangers, German Brandenburgers, Soviet partisans, Special Air Service, OSS operatives, all performed missions conventional forces couldn't. Commandos raided Norwegian coast, capturing or destroying targets. SAS operated behind German lines in North Africa, destroying aircraft on airfields. Rangers led assaults at D-Day. OSS coordinated with resistance movements, supplied partisans, conducted sabotage and espionage. These units were small, elite, trained for missions requiring stealth, initiative, unconventional tactics. Not all operations succeeded, some were disasters, but successes demonstrated value. Post-war, Special Operations Forces became permanent military components, expanding during Cold War for counterinsurgency, unconventional warfare, counterterrorism. The war proved that small, well-trained units conducting high-risk missions could achieve disproportionate impact, influencing military organization and doctrine permanently. Propaganda shaped perceptions, maintained morale, demonized enemies, encouraged sacrifice. Governments controlled information through censorship, managed public opinion through media, films, posters, radio broadcasts. Allied propaganda portrayed the war as fight for freedom, democracy, civilization against barbarism. Axis propaganda emphasized racial superiority, destiny, Lebensraum. Both sides exaggerated enemy atrocities while downplaying their own. Propaganda was often effective. Populations endured years of hardship, sacrifice, casualties without widespread dissent. But it also created problems. Exaggerations, once revealed, bred cynicism. Dehumanizing enemies made reconciliation difficult. Simplistic narratives obscured complexity. Post-war, populations more skeptical of official narratives, having been manipulated. The war demonstrated propaganda's power in modern states with mass media but also its dangers, creating echo chambers, distorting reality, preventing critical thinking. Totalitarian regimes used propaganda more systematically, but democracies also engaged extensively. The line between information and manipulation proved thin, troubling for societies claiming to value truth. The war's end left Europe physically devastated but politically divided. Soviet Union occupied Eastern Europe, installing communist governments in Poland, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany. These nations became satellite states, dominated by Moscow, forbidden from independent foreign policies. Winston Churchill warned in 1946 that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. The Cold War began before the Hot War ended. Germany was divided into occupation zones, Soviet in East, American, British, French in West. Berlin, deep in Soviet zone, was also divided, becoming flashpoint for crises. In 1948-49, Soviet blockade of West Berlin attempted to force Allied withdrawal, but Western powers supplied the city by airlift, demonstrating commitment to resist Soviet expansion. Germany's division solidified into two states, Capitalist Federal Republic, West Germany, and Communist German Democratic Republic, East Germany. This division symbolized broader European division, ideological split between capitalism and communism, democracy and dictatorship, West and East. Europe would remain divided for 45 years. Japan's occupation by America transformed the nation. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander, oversaw democratization, economic reform, constitutional revision. War criminals were prosecuted, militarists purged, emperors stripped of divine status. Women gained suffrage, land reforms benefited peasants, labor unions were legalized, education reformed. Japan's pacifist constitution, imposed by occupiers, renounced war and prohibited military forces beyond self-defense. Initially, Japanese resented occupation, but as Reconstruction proceeded and prosperity returned, attitudes shifted. American occupation was relatively benign compared to Soviet occupations elsewhere. By 1952, occupation ended, Japan regaining sovereignty but maintaining alliance with America, hosting U.S. military bases. Japan's reconstruction succeeded beyond expectations, becoming economic powerhouse, stable democracy, American ally. But relationship with the past remained complex. Pride and recovery coexisting with shame over wartime actions, pacifism coexisting with growing nationalism, alliance with America coexisting with resentment of dependence. Japan embodied contradictions of defeated power forced to reinvent itself. China emerged from the war devastated and divided. Fighting Japanese from 1937 to 1945, China suffered 15 to 20 million deaths, territory occupied, cities destroyed. But victory brought no peace. Civil war between nationalist government and communist forces resumed. Nationalists, corrupt and weakened by war, lost public support. Communists, who had fought Japanese effectively using guerrilla warfare, gained territory and legitimacy. By 1949, communists controlled mainland China, proclaiming People's Republic under Mao Zedong. Nationalist government fled to Taiwan, claiming to be legitimate government of all China. China's fall to communism shocked America, contributing to Cold War paranoia, McCarthyist witch hunts. Communist China aligned with Soviet Union, receiving aid and advisors, though Sino-Soviet split would develop in 1960s. China's transformation from Japanese victim to communist power was among war's most significant consequences, shifting Asian balance of power, setting stage for Korean War, Vietnam War, decades of regional instability. The war in China continued in forms beyond Japanese defeat. Suffering extended for millions. India gained independence in 1947, partly because the war had exhausted Britain's capacity to maintain empire. Indian forces had fought for Britain, 2.5 million served, expecting independence as reward. Instead, Britain postponed self-rule. Indian National Congress and Muslim League demanded freedom. After the war, Britain lacked resources and will to resist. Independence came in August 1947, but with partition into Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan, accompanied by horrific communal violence killing perhaps 1 million, displacing 12 million. Independence was triumph and tragedy. Freedom achieved after centuries of colonialism, but at cost of partition's bloodshed, ongoing India-Pakistan enmity, Kashmir conflict unresolved after 75 years. The war accelerated decolonization across Asia and Africa. British, French, Dutch, Belgian empires dissolved in coming decades. Independence movements, emboldened by wartime service, anti-colonial rhetoric, weakened colonizers, demanded freedom. The war destroyed European empires as thoroughly as it destroyed fascism, reshaping global politics for generations. The Nuremberg and Tokyo trials established principles of international law still relevant today. Nazi leaders were prosecuted for crimes against peace, waging aggressive war, war crimes, violating laws of war, and crimes against humanity, genocide, persecution. Defenses based on following orders or acting as state officials were rejected. Individuals could be held accountable regardless. 12 defendants were sentenced to death, others imprisoned. Tokyo trials prosecuted Japanese leaders similarly, executing 7 including Prime Minister Tojo. Critics argued trials were victor's justice, applying standards selectively. Soviet atrocities went unprosecuted. Allied bombing was not addressed. Nonetheless, trials established important precedents. Aggressive war is crime, genocide is crime, following orders is not defense. Individuals are accountable for atrocities. These principles influenced creation of International Criminal Court, prosecution of genocides in Yugoslavia and Rwanda, universal jurisdiction for crimes against humanity. Nuremberg's legacy is imperfect but significant. International law developed to constrain state violence, protect human rights, punish atrocities. The war's horrors created framework attempting to prevent recurrence. The war's memory has been contested, instrumentalized, revised continuously. Veterans wrote memoirs, historians analyzed decisions, nations constructed narratives. Initial histories emphasized Allied heroism, Axis evil, inevitable victory. Later histories complicated narratives, acknowledging Allied mistakes, atrocities, examining Axis perspectives, recovering stories of marginalized participants like women, minorities, colonials. Controversies persist. How to remember strategic bombing. Were atomic bombs necessary? Should focus be on combat or Holocaust? How should Axis nations remember? In Germany, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past, involved confronting Nazi crimes, teaching Holocaust, accepting responsibility. Japan's approach was more ambiguous, acknowledging wartime suffering while minimizing atrocities, creating regional tensions. In Eastern Europe, Soviet liberation narrative competed with recognition of Soviet crimes. Memory remained political, different groups emphasizing aspects that supported present concerns. But consensus existed that the war was catastrophe that should inform efforts to prevent future wars, that its lessons remained relevant, its victims deserved remembrance. The Greatest Generation label, popularized in America, praised those who lived through depression, fought the war, built post-war prosperity. It captured something real: collective sacrifice, sense of duty, resilience, achievement. But it also simplified, romanticized, overlooked complexity. Not all who lived through the era were heroes. Some collaborated with evil, some profited from others' suffering, some simply endured. Veterans themselves often resisted hero label, knowing that survival was often luck, that heroism was complicated, that killing, even in just cause, leaves scars. The label also marginalized contributions of women, minorities, others whose sacrifices fit less neatly into martial heroism narrative. And it created generational resentments. Later generations felt they could never measure up, that their struggles were dismissed as insignificant compared to the war. Perhaps every generation faces its own tests, requiring different forms of courage. The war generation deserves respect without worship, remembrance without myth-making, appreciation without impossible standards for successors. The question remains, was World War II inevitable given World War I's outcome, or could different decisions have prevented it? If Versailles had been less harsh, would German resentment have festered? If democracies had opposed Hitler militarily in 1936, would deterrence have worked? If America had joined League of Nations, would collective security have functioned? If Soviet Union and Western powers had allied earlier, could they have deterred or defeated Hitler before 1939? These counterfactuals are unanswerable but important. They suggest that human decisions matter, that history is not predetermined, that different choices might have prevented catastrophe. But they also reveal how difficult prevention is. Leaders operate with incomplete information, domestic pressures, competing priorities. Appeasement seems cowardly in retrospect but was rational response to publics refusing to contemplate another war. Versailles harshness seems vindictive in retrospect but represented desire to punish aggressor, prevent future threat. Perhaps the war emerged from complex interaction of structural factors and contingent decisions, neither fully inevitable nor easily preventable. The lesson might be that preventing catastrophe requires addressing both long-term conditions and immediate crises, that vigilance is perpetual burden, that there are no guarantees. The war's technology transformed warfare permanently. Jet aircraft developed late in war made piston aircraft obsolete. Radar allowed detecting aircraft and ships beyond visual range. Guided missiles V-1 and V-2 foreshadowed precision strike weapons. Atomic weapons created unprecedented destructive power. These technologies, refined post-war, shaped Cold War military competition. But the war also showed technology's limits. German technological sophistication, better tanks, jets, rockets, couldn't overcome Allied numerical superiority, industrial capacity. Technology alone doesn't guarantee victory. Logistics, tactics, strategy, morale all matter. Post-war militaries sought technological edges but understood that wars are won by complex combinations of factors. The nuclear revolution was different, fundamentally transforming strategic calculations, making great power war potentially suicidal. The war ushered an era where military technology could destroy civilization, where deterrence replaced victory as strategic objective, where avoiding war mattered as much as winning wars. This transformation, product of war's technological acceleration, remains defining feature of contemporary world. War's art and literature struggled to represent its scale and horror. Some works emphasized combat realism. Norman Mailer's The Naked and the Dead, James Jones's The Thin Red Line. Others explored moral complexity. Joseph Heller's Catch-22 satirized military bureaucracy's absurdity. Holocaust literature formed its own genre. Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz, Elie Wiesel's Night, bearing witness to suffering beyond language's capacity. Films ranged from propaganda to meditation. Casablanca, The Best Years of Our Lives, Apocalypse Now, set in Vietnam but about WWII's legacy. Each generation reinterprets the war through its own concerns. Recent works emphasize experience of civilians, women, children. Examine collaboration and resistance's complexities. Question triumphalist narratives. The war remains inexhaustible subject for art because it contained multitudes, heroism and cowardice, sacrifice and selfishness, resistance and collaboration, survival and destruction. Artists continue attempting to capture its meaning. Knowing complete representation is impossible, but the attempt remains necessary. The war changed everything while changing nothing. It destroyed fascism but birthed new authoritarianisms. It defeated racist imperialism but saw victor nations maintaining racial hierarchies domestically and colonial dominance globally for decades. It demonstrated war's horror but led to bigger, more dangerous Cold War military buildups. It created international institutions to prevent war, but these proved ineffective, preventing numerous post-war conflicts. It showed industrial civilization's capacity for both unprecedented destruction and remarkable reconstruction. Perhaps the war's lesson is that human nature doesn't fundamentally change. Capacities for both evil and good persist across time, but historical circumstances determine which prevail. The war created conditions where some goods could flourish: decolonization, human rights frameworks, international cooperation, economic development, but also conditions for new evils: nuclear proliferation, totalitarian expansion, proxy wars. We live in a world shaped by the war, inheriting both its positive legacies and unresolved problems. Understanding this inheritance is necessary for navigating present and shaping future. Children's books, films, games, and popular culture continue depicting the war, often simplified into struggle between absolute good and evil. This narrative contains truth. Nazism was evil, defeating it was necessary, but obscures complexity, moral ambiguities, difficult questions about means employed to achieve just ends. Simplification serves pedagogical purpose, teaching children about courage, sacrifice, standing against injustice. But it also risks creating cartoonish understanding, preventing grappling with war's full reality. Lessons about how ordinary people become perpetrators, how democracies can commit atrocities, how good intentions can produce terrible outcomes. Perhaps each age understands the war differently. Those who lived it understanding its chaos and ambiguity. Their children seeing it through Cold War lens of ideological struggle. Their grandchildren viewing it as defining moment of good versus evil. Their great-grandchildren struggling to understand something increasingly remote yet still shaping their world. Each generation must engage the war's history, memory, lessons anew, translating them for contemporary contexts. The war's refugees and displaced persons numbered in tens of millions. Germans fled westward from advancing Red Army. Poles were displaced by border changes. Jews surviving Holocaust had no homes to return to. Collaborators fled retribution. Ethnic Germans were expelled from Eastern Europe, up to 14 million displaced, hundreds of thousands dying in process. Refugee camps across Europe housed millions in immediate post-war years. International organizations like UNRRA attempted to provide aid, resettle displaced persons. Many emigrated to America, Palestine, Australia, elsewhere, starting new lives, bringing war's trauma with them. The scale of displacement was unprecedented, creating humanitarian crisis requiring years to address imperfectly. Displaced persons' experiences: losing everything, wandering Europe's ruins, living in camps, struggling to rebuild lives. Added layer of suffering to war's direct casualties. Their stories remind that war's costs extend beyond battlefield, that violence displaces peoples, that aftermath can be nearly as traumatic as conflict itself, that recovery takes generations. The Eastern Front's brutality exceeded Western Fronts, characterized by ideological hatred, racial policies, partisan warfare, scorched earth, mass atrocities. German forces viewed Soviet soldiers and civilians as subhuman, Slavs to be enslaved or exterminated. Soviet forces took revenge with equal brutality. Prisoners on both sides faced starvation, forced labor, execution. Over 3 million Soviet POWs died in German custody, deliberately starved, worked to death, shot. German POWs in Soviet camps fared nearly as badly. Civilians caught between armies suffered terribly. Villages burned, populations massacred, mass rape. Partisans fought behind German lines, prompting savage reprisals against civilians. The Eastern Front consumed over 30 million lives, military and civilian. It was war without restraint, revealing depths of human capacity for cruelty. Post-war, Soviet Union emphasized Great Patriotic War narrative, celebrating victory while obscuring Stalin's crimes, war's full costs. Understanding Eastern Front is essential for understanding the war. This was where most fighting, dying occurred. This was where Nazi ideology's genocidal logic was implemented most fully. This was where the war's outcome was truly decided. Resistance fighters in occupied territories faced impossible choices. Resist and risk death, torture, family members killed in reprisal? Collaborate and betray principles? Accommodate, doing minimum necessary to survive? Most chose accommodation. Not heroes or villains, just people trying to survive impossible situations. Some resisted actively, sabotaging infrastructure, gathering intelligence, hiding Jews, fighting Germans. Some collaborated actively, joining occupation police, denouncing neighbors, profiting from others' suffering. After liberation, resistance credentials were sometimes inflated, collaboration downplayed. Resistors were celebrated, collaborators punished, summary executions, imprisonment, shaming. But reality was complex. Some who collaborated also helped resistance. Some celebrated resistors accomplished little. Some who accommodated showed small acts of decency. Judging people who lived through unimaginable circumstances is difficult from comfortable distance. Perhaps the lesson is humility, hoping we would resist in similar situations but acknowledging uncertainty about how we would actually behave. The war tested millions under conditions we cannot truly imagine. Many failed that test. Some passed. Most fell somewhere between. The war's scientists faced ethical dilemmas about applying knowledge to destruction. Nuclear physicists working on Manhattan Project created weapon of unprecedented power, some later regretting their work, others justifying it as necessary to prevent Nazi bomb end war. Chemists developed napalm, poison gases, defoliants. Engineers designed bombers, submarines, missiles. Doctors conducted experiments, some legitimate medical research, some horrific Nazi and Japanese experiments using prisoners as subjects. After the war, questions arose about scientists' responsibilities. Should they refuse to develop weapons? Could they control how their discoveries were used? The Nuremberg Code established ethical principles for human experimentation in response to Nazi doctors' atrocities. Some scientists became arms control advocates, arguing their moral responsibility extended beyond laboratory. Others maintained scientific neutrality, claiming science is amoral, applications are politicians' responsibility. The debate continues. How should scientists balance advancing knowledge against potential misuse? The war made these questions urgent, relevant to nuclear weapons, biological warfare, autonomous weapons, artificial intelligence. Scientists' choices during the war established precedents still contested today. Naval battles like Leyte Gulf, largest naval battle in history, involved hundreds of ships and aircraft fighting across vast ocean areas. In October 1944, Japanese and American fleets clashed as Americans invaded Philippines. Japanese deployed battleships in desperate gambit, sacrificing carriers as decoys. American forces sank multiple Japanese capital ships, destroying Japanese Navy as effective force. Kamikaze attacks began during this battle, pilots deliberately crashing aircraft into American ships, accepting certain death to damage enemy. Kamikazes became symbol of Japanese fanaticism, willingness to sacrifice for emperor. But they also represented desperation. By late 1944, Japan lacked fuel, trained pilots, realistic war strategy. Kamikaze attacks inflicted damage, casualties, but couldn't change war's outcome. After the war, kamikaze pilots were remembered ambivalently, as heroes by some, tragic victims of militarism by others. The kamikaze phenomenon raised questions about when sacrifice becomes waste, when determination becomes delusion, when duty becomes complicity in hopeless cause. The war's aftermath saw denazification in Germany, attempting to purge Nazi influence from society, politics, economy. Former party members were dismissed from positions, sometimes imprisoned, sometimes executed. But comprehensive denazification proved impossible. Too many Germans had been involved. Society couldn't function removing everyone with Nazi associations. Gradually, denazification was relaxed. Many former Nazis resumed careers. Some became leaders of West Germany, justified as necessary for reconstruction. Critics argued this allowed Nazis to escape justice, perpetuated authoritarian attitudes. Defenders argued pragmatic accommodation was necessary, that new Germany needed experienced administrators regardless of past. East Germany claimed thorough denazification, portraying communism as anti-fascist, but also employed former Nazis when useful. The debate about how to handle former regime members after transitions from dictatorship to democracy remains relevant. Truth commissions versus trials, lustration versus reconciliation, justice versus stability. Germany's imperfect denazification was followed by successful democracy, suggesting no perfect answer exists, that societies must balance accountability with reconciliation, remembrance with moving forward. The war's logistics included transporting millions across oceans. Liberty ships, mass-produced cargo vessels, carried troops and supplies. Troop ships moved entire divisions. Cramped conditions, seasickness, submarine threats, boredom punctuated by anxiety. Returning wounded required hospital ships. Submarines prowled shipping lanes. Convoys protected by warships, aircraft attempted to reduce losses. Despite losses, Allied logistics succeeded, millions transported, supplied, sustained across global distances. Axis logistics struggled. Japan's merchant fleet destroyed by American submarines, cutting home islands from resources. Germany's supply lines stretched beyond sustainability in Russia. Superior Allied logistics reflected industrial capacity, organizational efficiency, control of seas. The war demonstrated that modern warfare requires moving material and personnel on unprecedented scales, that logistics determines what forces can accomplish operationally, that winning requires not just strong military but capable transportation, supply, maintenance systems. This lesson shaped Cold War logistics planning, continues influencing military organization today. The war was won not just on battlefields but in shipyards, rail yards, supply depots, transportation networks enabling combat forces to function. Medical personnel, doctors, nurses, medics worked under extreme conditions. Combat medics faced enemy fire retrieving wounded. Field hospitals operated near front lines, treating hundreds of casualties during battles. Nurses worked exhausting shifts, treating horrific injuries with limited supplies. Hospital ships transported wounded across oceans. Mental health personnel treated psychiatric casualties. Medical advances saved lives, but war produced casualties faster than medicine could handle. Triage determined who received treatment. Those who would survive with treatment were prioritized. Those who would survive without it waited. Those who would likely die regardless received comfort care. Medics and nurses witnessed suffering that exceeded peacetime medical experience. Some doctors conducted valuable research, improving trauma care, surgical techniques, infection control. Others participated in atrocities, Nazi doctors' experiments, euthanasia programs, Japanese Unit 731's biological warfare experiments using prisoners. After the war, medical personnel struggled processing what they'd witnessed, participation in system producing casualties. Combat medics were among war's heroes, unarmed but sharing soldiers' dangers, saving countless lives through courage and skill. Their contribution deserves recognition alongside combatants. The question of what if haunts the war's history. What if Hitler had focused on Mediterranean before invading Russia? What if Japan had not attacked Pearl Harbor, focusing on Southeast Asia, avoiding American entry? What if Germany had developed atomic bomb first? What if D-Day had failed? These counterfactuals are historically problematic. What happened happened. Speculation about alternatives is unprovable. But they illuminate decision-makers' choices, revealing contingency versus inevitability. Some outcomes seem inevitable in retrospect but weren't predetermined. Allied victory resulted from specific decisions, advantages, mistakes by axis. Different choices might have produced different outcomes, though probably not axis victory given underlying imbalances in resources, manpower, industrial capacity. Counterfactual thinking helps understand that history is not predetermined script but result of human decisions under uncertainty. It suggests that choices matter, that future isn't fixed, that our decisions today might prevent or cause future catastrophes. The war's study includes understanding not just what happened but what might have happened, appreciating contingency and necessity interacting to produce historical outcomes. The Manhattan Project, developing atomic bomb, was among history's most significant scientific industrial efforts. Begun in 1942, it employed over 130,000 people, cost nearly $2 billion, 1940s dollars, created facilities across America, required solving unprecedented scientific and engineering challenges. Physicists like Oppenheimer, Fermi, Szilard, Teller worked alongside engineers, chemists, mathematicians, technicians. Uranium enrichment required massive industrial facilities. Plutonium production required nuclear reactors. Weapon design required theoretical physics and practical engineering. Security was paramount. Compartmentalization limited what individuals knew. Counterintelligence prevented Soviet espionage. Unsuccessfully, Soviets penetrated project, accelerating their bomb program. The project succeeded remarkably quickly, testing first bomb at Alamogordo in July 1945. Witnessing explosion, Oppenheimer quoted Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds." Scientists felt mixture of triumph and dread. They'd succeeded technically but created weapon potentially ending civilization. The bomb's development under wartime urgency prevented thorough ethical debate beforehand. After the war, nuclear policy debates consumed decades, continue today. The Manhattan Project demonstrated what urgent, well-resourced scientific mobilization could achieve but also raised questions about scientific responsibility, technological determinism, whether some knowledge should remain undiscovered. Women in combat roles challenged gender norms. Soviet Union employed women as pilots, snipers, tank commanders, infantry. Night Witches, 588th Night Bomber Regiment, flew harassment missions over German lines. Ludmila Pavlichenko, Red Army sniper, was credited with 309 kills. Women served from necessity. Soviet manpower needs were desperate, but also demonstrated combat effectiveness. In Western militaries, women served in auxiliary roles, freeing men for combat. British women operated anti-aircraft batteries, detecting and engaging German aircraft. American WASPs ferried aircraft domestically. Women in resistance movements fought alongside men. After the war, most militaries excluded women from combat, returning to pre-war gender norms. But precedent was established. Gradually, over decades, militaries reopened combat roles to women. Today, many militaries integrate women fully, recognizing that competence, not gender, should determine military roles. The war proved women could perform under extreme stress, challenging assumptions about women's capabilities, contributing to slow, contested expansion of women's roles in military and society. Progress was uneven, meeting resistance, but direction was clear. Roles once closed to women gradually opened. The war's costs in cultural heritage were incalculable. Historic cities were destroyed: Warsaw, Dresden, Coventry, Rotterdam. Artifacts, artworks, libraries, archives were lost. Nazis systematically looted occupied territories, confiscating art for German museums or private collections. Some looted art has never been recovered. Battles damaged ancient sites. Monte Cassino's historic monastery was destroyed in fighting. Bombing devastated city centers, erasing medieval and Renaissance architecture. Post-war reconstruction sometimes rebuilt historic structures, sometimes replaced them with modern buildings. The war showed that civilization's physical heritage is fragile, that centuries of cultural accumulation can be destroyed in moments. It also demonstrated resilience. Communities rebuilt, restored, preserving what they could. Organizations like Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program worked to protect and recover cultural property. After the war, international law expanded to protect cultural heritage during conflicts. But the war's cultural losses remain tragic, irreplaceable. They remind that war destroys not just lives but accumulated human achievement. Memory embodied in places and objects that once lost are gone forever. War brides, women who married Allied soldiers and emigrated to their husbands' countries, numbered in hundreds of thousands. British, French, Italian, Dutch, German, Japanese, Filipino women married American, British, Canadian, Australian servicemen. They left families, cultures, languages, moving to unfamiliar countries, often facing prejudice. Japanese war brides faced particular hostility in America due to anti-Japanese sentiment. Some marriages succeeded, couples building lives together. Others ended in divorce, wives stranded in foreign countries. War bride experiences revealed challenges of cross-cultural marriages, difficulties of post-war adjustment, complexities of love formed under war's extreme circumstances. They also embodied reconciliation, former enemies joining through marriage, creating families bridging national divides. War brides contributed to multiculturalism, bringing languages, traditions, foods to adopted countries. Their stories remind that war produces not just hatred and division, but also unexpected connections. That even in catastrophe humans form relationships, that love and desire transcend political enmities. War brides' experiences are part of war's legacy, usually overlooked in military histories, but important for understanding war's full human dimension. The war's black markets flourished amid scarcity and rationing. Goods could be obtained through illegal channels for those with money or connections. Cigarettes became currency. Corruption was endemic. Officials accepted bribes. Merchants hoarded goods. Criminals profited from shortages. After liberation, black markets continued, exacerbated by economic disruption, refugees, occupation forces creating demand. American soldiers traded cigarettes, chocolate, coffee for local goods, services. Profiteering created resentments, but markets also allowed survival. People obtained food, clothing through black markets when legal channels failed. Occupied populations often depended on illegal trade. Post-war, black markets gradually declined as economies recovered. Controls were lifted, supplies normalized. But the war showed that economic controls, however necessary, create opportunities for corruption, that scarcity breeds illegal markets, that moralistic distinctions between legal and illegal break down when survival is at stake. The war's economic history includes not just official policies but informal economies, survival strategies, moral compromises people made under extreme conditions. Occupation experiences varied enormously by location and occupier. German occupation of Western Europe was relatively restrained compared to Eastern Europe. In France, Nazis requisitioned resources, imposed curfews, censored press, persecuted Jews, executed resistors, but daily life continued for those who accommodated. In Eastern Europe, German occupation was genocidal, entire populations targeted for extermination or slavery. Soviet occupation of Eastern Germany involved mass rape, looting, deportations. Japanese occupation of Asian territories was brutal. Forced labor, comfort women, mass executions, starvation. Allied occupations were generally humane, focused on reconstruction, demobilization, democratization. But even benign occupations involved restrictions, foreign troops' presence, cultural tensions. Occupied populations experienced loss of sovereignty, humiliation, rationing, danger. Some collaborated, some resisted, most tried to survive. After liberation, occupied nations faced reckoning with collaboration, punishment of traitors, reintegration of resistors. Occupation experiences shaped post-war politics, attitudes toward occupiers and liberators, memories of war years. Understanding occupation is essential for understanding the war. Most Europeans lived under occupation for years, their experiences fundamentally shaped by it. The war songs reflected evolving attitudes. Early patriotic enthusiasm in Over There, We'll Meet Again, White Cliffs of Dover. Later weariness and longing in soldier songs. Post-war reflection in Where Have All the Flowers Gone? Music sustained morale, provided entertainment, expressed emotions language couldn't capture. Big bands played for troops. Folk songs emerged from soldiers' experiences. Enemy songs were translated, revealing common humanity. German soldiers sang of home, love, comrades, same themes as Allied songs. Propaganda songs demonized enemies, celebrated victories, encouraged production. After the war, some songs became nostalgic reminders of shared sacrifice, national unity. Others became anti-war anthems, warnings against militarism. Music from the war continues resonating. We'll Meet Again ended Dr. Strangelove, ironically accompanying Nuclear Apocalypse. Lily Marlene transcended sides, sung by German and Allied forces. Music reminds that war has emotional dimensions, that soldiers and civilians processed experiences through song, that culture produced during catastrophe becomes legacy, carrying meanings that evolve but don't disappear. The war's music is part of its history, expressing aspects that statistics and strategy cannot. The Warsaw Uprising of August-October 1944 exemplified resistance's tragedy. Polish Home Army rebelled against German occupation, expecting Soviet forces approaching Warsaw to assist. Instead, Soviets halted outside city, allowing Germans to crush uprising. For 63 days, Poles fought with desperate courage, inadequate weapons, no outside help. Germans responded with systematic destruction, massacring civilians, burning city block by block. By October, Poles surrendered. Casualties exceeded 200,000, mostly civilians. Warsaw was razed. Germans demolished remaining structures methodically. Soviets finally entered ruins in January 1945, installing communist government. The uprising's failure, Soviet betrayal, Warsaw's destruction became defining trauma for Poland. Questions remain. Should Poles have rebelled knowing they couldn't win? Were Soviets complicit in uprising's failure, allowing Germans to destroy potential anti-communist resistance? The uprising embodied courage and tragedy, people choosing to fight despite odds, believing freedom worth dying for, learning that valor doesn't guarantee success, that geopolitics can doom noblest efforts. Warsaw's ruins symbolized Poland's fate, caught between German and Soviet tyrannies, suffering regardless of choices, sacrificing yet losing. The war's end brought revelations about the Holocaust's full scale. Concentration camps, death camps, ghettos, the systematic extermination infrastructure shocked even those who'd known of Nazi anti-Semitism. The evidence was overwhelming. Gas chambers, crematoria, mass graves, warehouses of victims' belongings, survivors' testimonies, meticulous German records. Liberators photographed, filmed the camps, documenting atrocities. Eisenhower ordered German civilians to tour camps, confronting what had been done in their name. Survivors began sharing testimonies, though many remained silent for decades, unable to speak of trauma. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted Holocaust perpetrators, establishing legal precedents. Never again became pledge, though subsequent genocides proved it aspiration not reality. Holocaust studies emerged as academic field, examining how genocide occurred, why bystanders didn't intervene, how survivors coped. Memorials and museums preserve memory. Holocaust education teaches about prejudice's dangers, totalitarianism's evil, importance of resistance. But the Holocaust remains incomprehensible. Understanding how it happened doesn't explain why humans capable of creating art, philosophy, science were also capable of industrialized genocide. The question of how humans can do such things remains unanswered, troubling, demanding continued vigilance against hatred, dehumanization, authoritarianism. Island hopping in Pacific created iconic battles. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each island was nightmare. Entrenched Japanese defenders fighting to death, terrain favoring defense, tropical diseases, brutal climate. American forces advanced with overwhelming firepower, naval bombardment, aerial bombing, flamethrowers, tanks. But Japanese fought from caves, bunkers, tunnels, requiring close combat to eliminate. Casualties were terrible on both sides. At Iwo Jima, raising flag on Mount Suribachi became iconic image symbolizing American determination. At Okinawa, Over 100,000 Japanese and 50,000 American casualties demonstrated invasion of Japan's home islands would be catastrophic. Island battles brutality, Japanese refusal to surrender, kamikaze attacks convinced American planners that invasion would cost hundreds of thousands of casualties, influencing decision to use atomic bombs. Island veterans faced unique challenges: jungle warfare's privations, Japanese defenders' fanaticism, feeling their battles were forgotten compared to European theater. The Pacific War was different war, racial animosity, distances, environments, enemy tactics created distinct character, leaving different scars on those who fought it. The British Royal Air Force's Bomber Command conducted strategic bombing of Germany, losing 55,000 aircrew, higher casualty rate than any British service. Bomber crews flew 30 missions before completing tour, facing flak, fighters, mechanical failures, weather. Survival odds were roughly 1 in 3. They bombed at night to reduce losses, sacrificing accuracy. Area bombing targeted cities, killing civilians, destroying housing, disrupting production. Air Marshal Harris believed bombing could win war alone. Results were debatable. German production continued increasing into 1944. Morale didn't break, but resources were diverted to air defense. Transportation was disrupted. After the war, Bomber Command's contribution was downplayed. Crews received no campaign medal. Harris was criticized for area bombing's morality, defended his crew's sacrifice. Bomber crews saw themselves as doing necessary job under terrible odds, taking war to Germany when no other option existed. The strategic bombing debate continues. Was it effective? Was it moral? Could resources have been better used? Bomber Command's story exemplifies war's moral complexity. Brave men conducting missions of questionable effectiveness and ethics, suffering terrible casualties, receiving inadequate recognition because their role raised uncomfortable questions. The war's codebreakers at Bletchley Park broke German Enigma codes, providing intelligence that shortened the war. Alan Turing, mathematician and computer science pioneer, developed methods for decrypting German messages. Ultra-intelligence from Enigma decrypts helped win Battle of Atlantic, Desert War, aided D-Day planning. But successes were kept secret for decades after the war. Revealing that codes were broken would have compromised post-war intelligence operations. Turing received no public recognition during lifetime, was prosecuted for homosexuality in 1952, accepted chemical castration to avoid imprisonment, died in 1954, likely suicide. Only decades later was Bletchley Park's contribution revealed. Turing recognized as war hero and computing pioneer. His story exemplifies war's hidden dimensions, crucial contributions unknown for years, individuals sacrificing recognition for security, intelligence work's thankless nature. It also exemplifies society's failures, persecuting those who served it, discriminating against minorities, failing to honor heroes who didn't fit conventional narratives. Turing's eventual recognition, posthumous pardon, celebration of his achievements partially redress historical injustice, but cannot undo damage done to him and countless others whose contributions were forgotten or whose differences were punished. Military cemeteries across Europe, Asia, Pacific preserve memory in endless rows of white crosses and stars. Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemeteries are maintained immaculately, each grave marked with headstone including name, age, regiment, sometimes personal inscriptions chosen by families. American cemeteries overseas, like Normandy American Cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach, are similarly maintained. German cemeteries are darker, more somber, black crosses, less triumphalist. Soviet memorials emphasize collective sacrifice, often featuring heroic statues, eternal flames. Each nation remembers differently, memorials reflecting national narratives, values, relationships with the past. Visiting cemeteries confronts visitors with war's human cost made visible through individual graves representing individual lives. Young ages recorded on headstones, 19, 21, 23, emphasize loss of potential, futures unrealized. Cemeteries are pilgrimage sites for families, schools, tourists, serving educational and commemorative purposes. They ask visitors to remember, honor sacrifice, and perhaps question whether causes justified such costs. Well-maintained cemeteries suggest continuing obligation to those who died, that forgetting them would compound tragedy. The Marshall Plan, announced by Secretary of State George Marshall in 1947, provided $13 billion to rebuild Western European economies. Motivated partly by humanitarian concerns, partly by desire to prevent communist expansion, it succeeded brilliantly. European economies recovered, strengthening democracies, creating trading partners, integrating Western Europe into American-led international order. Communist countries were invited but declined under Soviet pressure. The contrast between recovering Western Europe and stagnating Eastern Europe under Soviet control demonstrated capitalism's advantages. The Marshall Plan exemplified enlightened self-interest, aiding others while serving American interests. It helped prevent post-World War II economic collapse similar to post-World War I, which had contributed to WWII's causes. Critics noted it also served to open European markets to American goods. That aid came with conditions that America benefited economically and politically. But compared to alternatives, allowing European suffering, communist expansion, economic chaos, the Marshall Plan was remarkably successful policy. It suggested that victors treating defeated generously produces better outcomes than vindictive peace settlements. Lesson Versailles should have taught but didn't. The plan remains model for post-conflict reconstruction, though rarely replicated with similar success. Post-war baby boom reflected mixture of optimism, delayed family formation, returning servicemen eager to resume civilian lives. In victor nations, economic growth, confidence in future encouraged large families. Birth rates spiked in late 1940s to 1950s, creating generation larger than predecessors. Baby boomers would shape subsequent decades. 1960s youth culture, protests, rock music. 1980s, 90s economic prosperity. 2010s to 2020s aging population straining social services. Demographically, the boom meant population spike working its way through age structure, creating successive bulges, school enrollment surge, labor force growth, retirement wave. But in nations devastated by war, Soviet Union, Germany, Poland, birth rates took years to recover, war's demographic impact visible in missing cohorts. The boom reflected not just returning normality but desire to affirm life after years confronting death, to rebuild families as nations rebuilt infrastructure, to create futures when recent past had seemed to foreclose possibilities. The boom generation inherited world shaped by war, benefited from peace and prosperity purchased by parents' sacrifices, sometimes took that peace for granted, learned hard way that their privileges were historically contingent, not natural conditions. The question of guilt and responsibility extended beyond leaders to populations. Were Germans collectively responsible for Nazism, Holocaust? Were Japanese collectively responsible for atrocities in Asia? Collective guilt concept was controversial. Punishing entire populations for government's crimes seemed unjust, yet passive acquiescence, active participation, ideological support by millions made atrocities possible. In Germany, Allied policy oscillated between punishment and rehabilitation, finally settling on holding individuals accountable while helping Germany rebuild. German society engaged in ongoing Vergangenheitsbewältigung, wrestling with past, acknowledging crimes, accepting responsibility, teaching younger generations. In Japan, process was less thorough, emperor retained, elites remained influential, textbooks downplayed atrocities. Collective guilt debates raised philosophical questions about individual versus collective responsibility, how to balance accountability with reconciliation, whether nations can sin, how shame and acknowledgement relate to healing. Perhaps key distinction is between guilt, legal culpability for specific acts, and responsibility, collective obligation to acknowledge past, make amends, ensure non-recurrence. Germans today aren't guilty of Holocaust but have responsibility to remember it, combat anti-Semitism, teach its lessons. This distinction allows moving forward while honoring memory, accepting responsibility without paralyzing guilt. The war created innovations still used: ballpoint pens, reliable in aircraft at altitude; synthetic rubber, replacing unavailable natural rubber; microwave ovens from radar technology; aerosol cans, for insecticide; duct tape, sealing ammunition cases; superglue, bonding aircraft canopies. These mundane objects carry war's legacy invisibly. Medical innovations included antibiotics mass production, blood transfusion techniques, surgical advances, treatments for burns and trauma. Organizational innovations included project management techniques, logistics systems, command and control structures. The war accelerated developments that might have occurred eventually but advanced them decades. It demonstrated that urgent necessity, unlimited resources, organized effort could solve previously intractable problems. Post-war prosperity partly resulted from adapting wartime innovations to peacetime purposes, converting military technologies to civilian uses, employing organizational techniques developed for war production. But this raises uncomfortable questions. Must humanity experience catastrophe to spur innovation? Could similar progress occur without war's urgency? Why do societies mobilize resources for destruction but not consistently for positive purposes like poverty elimination, climate change mitigation, disease eradication? The war proved what humanity can achieve when united by crisis. The challenge is achieving similar without requiring catastrophe as catalyst. Resistance movement's effectiveness is debated. Did sabotage significantly impair Axis war efforts? Did intelligence from resistance networks justify risks? Did uprisings help or hinder liberation? Arguments favor significance. Resistance tied down occupation troops, disrupted logistics, provided intelligence, maintained morale, aided Allied operations. Arguments against. Resistance activities prompted brutal reprisals against civilians, sometimes hindered Allied military plans, achieved limited military impact. Perhaps resistance's greatest value was moral rather than military, demonstrating that occupied peoples opposed occupation, maintaining national spirit, creating heroic narratives for post-war national identities. After liberation, resistance credentials provided political legitimacy. In France, politicians emphasized resistance participation while minimizing collaboration. Communist parties claimed resistance leadership, enhancing post-war influence. Some resistance claims were exaggerated, collaboration was common, resistance was minority activity. But genuine resistors deserved honor. They risked everything for principles, ideals, national independence. Whether military effectiveness justified costs, their choice to resist had moral weight, testified to human capacity for courage under tyranny, inspired later resistance movements globally. Resistance was answer to question. What should one do when evil rules? Some said nothing. Some said resist. Those who resisted kept alive possibility that individuals could defy overwhelming power, that choices mattered even when futile. The war's turning points are identified variously. Stalingrad, German advance stopped permanently. Midway, Japan loses carrier advantage. El Alamein, Axis expelled from North Africa. Kursk, last German offensive fails. Perhaps there was no single turning point but cumulative shift as Allied resources, manpower, industrial capacity overwhelmed Axis. By late 1942, trends favored Allies. America's industrial might mobilizing, Soviet Union absorbing losses while growing stronger, Britain enduring, Germany and Japan overextended, unable to replace losses. Axis strategy required quick victories. Attritional war favored resource-rich allies. Yet outcomes weren't predetermined. Different decisions, luck, contingencies might have altered war's course, though probably not its ultimate result given underlying imbalances. Identifying turning points serves narrative's needs, creating dramatic structure, suggesting when outcome became inevitable. But history is messier. Trajectories shift gradually. Outcomes remain uncertain longer than retrospect suggests. Contemporaries didn't know they were living through turning points until after the fact. Perhaps instead of searching for moments when war was won, we should recognize that victory resulted from sustained effort across years, multiple theaters, countless individual actions and decisions accumulating into outcomes that changed history. The war's legacies include United Nations, decolonization, nuclear weapons, Cold War, Holocaust memory, human rights frameworks, international law expansion, economic globalization, technological advances, demographic changes, social transformations. We inhabit world fundamentally shaped by the war, borders drawn after it, institutions created to prevent its recurrence, technologies developed during it, social changes it accelerated. The war ended European global dominance, began American and Soviet superpower rivalry, sparked independence movements that dissolved empires, created Israel, divided Germany and Korea, reconfigured global economy, demonstrated nuclear weapons' apocalyptic potential, revealed genocide's horror, forced confrontation with totalitarianism's evil. Understanding present requires understanding the war. Conflicts in Middle East trace to post-war arrangements. Cold War ended but its structures persist. Nuclear weapons still threaten. Genocide recurs despite never again pledges. Nationalism and authoritarianism resurge. The war's lessons about fascism's dangers, appeasement's failures, vigilance's necessity, international cooperation's value, human rights' fragility remain relevant. We're far enough from the war that direct memory is disappearing. Last veterans are dying, but close enough that its consequences remain lived reality. Preserving memory while applying lessons appropriately is challenge for generations inheriting the war's world without experiencing it. Individual stories illuminate the war's human dimension in ways statistics cannot. And Frank's diary, written hiding from Nazis in Amsterdam, ended when family was betrayed, sent to camps where and died of typhus weeks before liberation. Desmond Doss, Seventh-day Adventist conscientious objector, served as combat medic, saved 75 men at Okinawa without carrying weapon, received Medal of Honor. Witold Pilecki volunteered to be imprisoned in Auschwitz, organized resistance inside, escaped to report on Holocaust, was later executed by Communist Poland. These stories and millions of others, each unique, irreplaceable, carrying individual tragedies, heroisms, choices, losses, constitute the war's true history. Numbers: 70 million dead, countless wounded, displaced, traumatized, abstract suffering that cannot be truly comprehended. Individual stories restore humanity, allow connection across decades. Remember that statistics represent people who lived, loved, suffered, sometimes chose courageously, sometimes failed, usually did what they could to survive. Preserving individual stories before they're lost matters because they teach what general histories cannot. The war's texture, its moral complexity, how ordinary people confronted extraordinary evil, how they failed and succeeded, how they remained human when humanity seemed impossible. The war's veterans spoke rarely of combat experiences, trauma remaining private. Many couldn't communicate what they'd witnessed, felt civilians wouldn't understand, struggled with memories that didn't fade. Some drank, raged, withdrew. Others seemed fine but carried wounds invisibly. Children of veterans often knew little of parents' service. War wasn't discussed, remained mysterious absence in family histories. Only in old age did some veterans begin sharing stories, prompted by approaching mortality, desire to leave testimony, recognition that soon no living witnesses would remain. Oral history projects recorded veterans' memories, preserving them before they were lost. These testimonies revealed what official histories overlooked: the confusion, fear, randomness, small kindnesses amid horror, moral ambiguities, luck's role in survival, lasting bonds with comrades, difficulty of killing, trauma's persistence. Veterans emphasized war's reality differed from movies: less heroic, more chaotic, banal mixed with terrifying. They wanted younger generations to understand war's true cost, not glorify it. As the greatest generation passes, their testimonies become primary sources for future historians, irreplaceable windows into lived experience. Recording, preserving, studying veteran stories is urgent work. Each death closes a perspective forever. Their voices remind us that history isn't abstract. It's lived by real people whose experiences deserve remembrance, whose lessons should inform present choices. The war's aerial combat evolved from dogfights to bomber formations to jet interceptors. Fighter tactics developed: energy fighting, boom and zoom, deflection shooting. Bomber crews faced flak, fighters, mechanical failures, whether on missions deep into enemy territory. Ball turret gunners, trapped in cramped spheres under bombers, faced psychological terror and danger. Tail gunners watched fighters approach, unable to evade. Pilots fought mechanical limitations, spins, stalls, engine failures at critical moments. Aces became celebrities, but most pilots died or were shot down before achieving ace status. Aerial combat was statistically deadly. Bomber crews over Germany faced casualty rates exceeding infantry. Yet they continued flying mission after mission, facing terror each time. Fighter pilots described combat as mixture of boredom and adrenaline, hours of patrol punctuated by minutes of violent action. Surviving depended on skill, aircraft quality, tactics, and luck. Post-war, jet aircraft rendered piston fighters obsolete almost immediately. But the courage of those who flew propeller aircraft into flak and fighters remained. They fought with technology available, accepting odds that seemed suicidal in retrospect. The home front's propaganda shaped perceptions that influenced post-war attitudes. In America, posters encouraged production, secrecy, conservation, bond purchases. Rosie the Riveter symbolized women in industry. Enemies were caricatured as barbaric, subhuman. In Britain, keep calm and carry on epitomized stoic endurance. In Germany, propaganda emphasized racial superiority, Jewish conspiracy, existential struggle. In Japan, propaganda portrayed war as liberating Asia from Western imperialism. Soviet propaganda emphasized great patriotic war, defending motherland. Children grew up saturated in these narratives, internalizing values, hatreds, loyalties. After the war, propaganda's effectiveness was recognized. All sides had manipulated populations successfully. This created post-war skepticism about government messaging, contributing to credibility gaps in subsequent conflicts. But the war also demonstrated that democracies could mobilize populations without totalitarian methods, that free societies could match dictatorships' organization when threatened. The tension between necessary mobilization and honest communication remains unresolved. Wars require unity, sacrifice, morale maintenance, yet democracies value truth, dissent, informed consent. Balancing these needs challenges wartime governments, as Vietnam and subsequent conflicts demonstrated. The war showed that propaganda works, but also that its effects outlast wars, shaping societies for generations. Post-war reconstruction transformed landscapes and societies. Cities were rebuilt, some restored historically, others modernized. Infrastructure was reconstructed: roads, bridges, railroads, ports. Industries were rebuilt with modern equipment, increasing productivity. Housing was constructed for millions displaced or homeless. The scale was unprecedented, requiring decades and massive investment. Marshall Plan aided Western Europe. Soviet aid rebuilt Eastern Europe under communist systems. Japan reconstructed rapidly under American occupation's guidance. Germany's reconstruction, divided between East and West, produced contrasting outcomes. West Germany prospered, East Germany stagnated under communism. Reconstruction was opportunity to modernize, improve on pre-war arrangements, incorporate new technologies, plan rationally. But it also erased historic fabric, destroyed neighborhoods, displaced communities. Some mourned loss of historic cities, cultural continuity. Others celebrated modernization, improved living conditions. Reconstruction debates continue. Should historic architecture be restored exactly or adapted? How to balance preservation and progress? These questions arose acutely after the war but remain relevant wherever conflict destroys built environments. Reconstruction's success varied. Some nations recovered quickly, others struggled for decades. Success depended on aid received, governance quality, social cohesion, luck. But across Europe and Asia, the war's physical scars gradually healed, though memory remained. The question of forgiveness haunted post-war years. Could victims forgive perpetrators? Should nations reconcile or maintain enmity? Jewish survivors faced Germans who'd murdered families. Polish victims faced Ukrainian collaborators. French faced collaborators among neighbors. Victims' responses varied. Some forgave, finding peace in letting go. Some couldn't forgive, carrying hatred justifiably. Some distinguished between individual Germans/Japanese and Nazi/militarist systems. National reconciliations occurred. France and Germany became allies, founding European Union together. America occupied but befriended Japan. Israel and Germany developed relationship. These reconciliations were pragmatic, strategic, necessary for peace, but also reflected recognition that hatred's perpetuation harms holders, that future generations shouldn't inherit enmities. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting German contrition, Holocaust education. Memorials maintained memory while allowing forward movement. But reconciliation remained incomplete, contested. Some felt betrayals could never be forgiven, that moving on dishonored victims. Perhaps forgiveness is individual choice, not collective demand. Societies can reconcile without requiring individuals forgive. The tension between justice and mercy, remembrance and reconciliation, continues shaping how societies relate to violent pasts, how former enemies become partners, how humanity might escape cycles of retribution. War crimes trials beyond Nuremberg and Tokyo occurred across Europe and Asia. France tried collaborators, Pétain, Laval, others executing some, imprisoning others. Netherlands tried Dutch Nazis. Norway tried Quisling, whose name became synonym for collaboration. Poland, Soviet Union, other nations tried collaborators, war criminals captured in their territories. Trials varied in fairness. Some were judicial processes, others show trials with predetermined outcomes. Japan conducted trials of Allied personnel for war crimes, sometimes executing them unjustly. After the war, these trials were controversial: victor's justice, ex post facto law, selective prosecution. But they established principle of individual accountability for atrocities, influenced international law development, provided historical records of crimes, offered some justice for victims. Limitations were clear. Many perpetrators escaped, went unpunished, resumed normal lives. Some nations failed to prosecute adequately, prioritizing reconciliation or lacking capacity. Decades later, war criminals were still being prosecuted. Nazi hunters like Wiesenthal tracked fugitives. Aging perpetrators were tried in 1960s, 1970s, even later. The question of whether justice delayed decades is justice at all remains debated. But pursuit of accountability, even imperfect and partial, affirmed that certain crimes cannot be forgotten, that perpetrators cannot escape responsibility forever, that victims deserve recognition. The war's spies and intelligence agents operated in shadows, their work often remaining classified for decades. Double agents like Garbo fed misinformation to Germans, supporting D-Day deception. Codebreakers like those at Bletchley Park provided intelligence that changed war's course. Spy networks gathered information at great risk. Resistance movements sent intelligence to allies. Some agents were captured, tortured, executed. Others survived but couldn't discuss their work due to secrecy requirements. Women served prominently in intelligence. SOE agents parachuted into France. Wireless operators transmitted from occupied territories. Codebreakers worked at Bletchley Park. After the war, intelligence services expanded, continuing Cold War espionage. Some wartime agents became Cold Warriors, applying skills to new conflict. Others retired to obscurity, their contributions unknown. Gradual declassification revealed intelligence's importance. Battles won through information advantage, operations succeeded through deception, disasters avoided through warning. But intelligence work's nature, secretive, morally ambiguous, sometimes failing, meant contributions were under-recognized. Spies and intelligence personnel were among war's essential but invisible participants, whose work shaped outcomes but whose stories emerged slowly, incompletely, long after the fact, if ever. Collaboration varied from opportunistic profiteering to ideological commitment to simply trying to survive. In occupied territories, some joined occupation police, administered for occupiers, informed on neighbors. Motivations varied, believing Nazi ideology, anti-communism, anti-Semitism, careerism, coercion, self-preservation. After liberation, collaborators faced punishment, summary executions, imprisonment, public shaming, economic ruin. Women accused of horizontal collaboration, sexual relationships with occupiers, were publicly humiliated, heads shaved. But circumstances were complex. Some collaborators also helped resistance, some protected Jews while serving occupation governments, some were coerced. And who judged? In France, resistors and former collaborators disputed who had truly resisted, sometimes settling scores under guise of justice. In Netherlands, extensive collaboration created post-war shame, reluctance to discuss war years. In Norway, Quisling's government was so unpopular that collaboration was limited. Each nation's collaboration history reflected circumstances, occupation's harshness, alternatives available, cultural factors. Judging those who lived under impossible circumstances is difficult. Perhaps the lesson is humility, hoping we would resist but uncertain how we'd actually behave, recognizing survival instincts are powerful, that heroic resistance was rare, that most people tried to survive, navigate impossible situations as best they could. The war's refugee crisis involved unprecedented numbers. Millions fled advancing armies, bombed cities, persecution. Jewish refugees sought safety anywhere. Some reached neutral countries, allied nations, Palestine. Most were trapped, murdered. Displaced persons after the war numbered tens of millions. Germans expelled from Eastern Europe, Poles displaced by border shifts, Holocaust survivors with no homes, refugees from communism. Camps housed refugees for years while resettlement was arranged. Many emigrated to America, Canada, Australia, Palestine/Israel, South America. Refugees brought trauma, lost everything, started over in unfamiliar countries, often facing discrimination, struggling with language, culture, economic hardship. But they also brought skills, education, determination, enriching adopted countries. Post-war immigration policies varied. Some nations welcomed refugees, others restricted entry based on ethnicity, religion, politics. Jewish refugees faced particular difficulties. Many countries refused entry before and during the war, contributing to Holocaust's death toll. After the war, Holocaust survivors' experiences influenced creation of Israel, refugee law development, human rights frameworks. The war demonstrated that displacement is modern warfare's inevitable consequence, that nations have obligations toward refugees, that refuge can save lives, that addressing refugee crises requires international cooperation, resources, political will. These lessons remain relevant as conflicts continue producing refugees today. Children's experiences varied from relative safety to unimaginable trauma. British children evacuated from cities to countryside lived with strangers, separated from families. American children experienced war through rationing, father's absence, newsreels, war bonds. Soviet children survived siege of Leningrad, occupation, partisan warfare. Jewish children hid, often separated from families, survived concentration camps, became orphans. German children experienced bombing, defeat, occupation. Japanese children faced firebombing, atomic bombs, starvation. Child soldiers fought. Hitler Youth defended Berlin. Children served in resistance movements. Evacuee experiences ranged from positive to traumatic. Some foster families were kind, others abusive. Children in war zones witnessed violence, experienced starvation, lost families. Psychological impacts lasted lifetimes. Many carried trauma silently, unable to process childhood experiences. Others became determined to prevent future wars, build better world. Children of war generation shaped post-war societies, their attitudes formed by wartime childhoods. Their stories remind that war traumatizes even non-combatants, that children are particularly vulnerable, that protecting children should be priority during conflicts. Yet wars continue traumatizing children, demonstrating that lessons from the war's child victims haven't been adequately learned, that preventing children's suffering requires preventing wars themselves. The Pacific Theater's logistics challenged American forces uniquely. Fighting across vast ocean distances required floating supply chains, ships carrying everything needed, from ammunition to food to fresh water. Island bases provided staging areas but required construction under combat conditions. Seabees built airfields, ports, roads, facilities under fire. Supplies moved by ships vulnerable to submarine air attack. Jungle environments caused equipment deterioration, disease, supply shortages. Wounded required lengthy evacuation across oceans. The logistics burden was enormous, but American industrial capacity and organizational skill met challenges. Liberty ships, mass-produced tankers, specialized vessels created supply networks spanning Pacific. MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Campaign and Nimitz's Central Pacific Drive both required elaborate logistics. Supplying forces fighting on isolated islands thousands of miles from bases showcased American logistical capabilities. By contrast, Japan's logistics collapsed, merchant fleet destroyed by submarines, home islands cut off from resources, forces in Pacific and Asia isolated, starving. The Pacific War was won as much by logistics as combat, demonstrating that supplying forces matters as much as defeating enemies, that modern warfare's reach depends on logistical capacity to project power across distances. The war's aftermath saw different fates for Axis leaders. Hitler committed suicide in Berlin bunker. Mussolini was captured by Italian partisans, executed, his body displayed hanging upside down in Milan. Nazi leaders were tried at Nuremberg, Göring, Hess, Ribbentrop, others, some executed, some imprisoned. Japanese leaders were tried in Tokyo, Tojo and 6 others executed. Some leaders escaped. Eichmann fled to Argentina, was captured by Mossad in 1960, tried in Israel, executed. Mengele fled to South America, died in Brazil in 1979 unpunished. Thousands of lower-level officials, camp guards, collaborators escaped prosecution, resumed normal lives, their crimes undiscovered or unprosecuted. This created lasting sense of incomplete justice. Many perpetrators escaped accountability. Victims' suffering wasn't fully addressed. But prosecuting leaders established precedent that heads of state could be held accountable, that sovereign immunity didn't protect from prosecution for atrocities. This principle influenced creation of International Criminal Court, prosecutions in Yugoslavia and Rwanda. Though implementation remains selective, powerful nations resist international jurisdiction. The question of how to hold leaders accountable while preventing victors' justice, how to balance punishment with reconciliation, continues challenging international law, post-conflict justice efforts. The war's trials were imperfect but established frameworks still evolving. The war's technology included early computers like Colossus and ENIAC. Colossus, developed at Bletchley Park, helped break German codes, demonstrating electronic computing's military value. ENIAC, developed in America, performed ballistics calculations, later worked on hydrogen bomb design. These massive, room-sized machines using vacuum tubes were primitive by current standards but revolutionary then, establishing computing's potential. After the war, computing advanced rapidly. Transistors replaced vacuum tubes, integrated circuits miniaturized components, personal computers democratized access. Computing revolution traces roots to wartime code-breaking, ballistics calculations, demonstrating that military necessity drove technological development that transformed civilian life. But this pattern raises questions. Why does war accelerate innovation? Could similar progress occur without military drivers? The war showed that massive investment, urgent need, organized effort could solve problems quickly, but required catastrophe as catalyst. Post-war, some innovation occurred through military spending, Internet's origins in ARPA projects, but civilian applications drove much progress. The relationship between military technology and civilian benefits remains complex, troubling, undeniable. Computing, emerging from war's necessities, transformed modern life more profoundly than almost any wartime technology, though nuclear weapons remain more dangerous, less beneficial legacy. The war's technology included early computers like Colossus and ENIAC. Colossus, developed at Bletchley Park, helped break German codes, demonstrating electronic computing's military value. ENIAC, developed in America, performed ballistics calculations, later worked on hydrogen bomb design. These massive, room-sized machines using vacuum tubes were primitive by current standards but revolutionary then, establishing computing's potential. After the war, computing advanced rapidly. Transistors replaced vacuum tubes, integrated circuits miniaturized components, personal computers democratized access. Computing revolution traces roots to wartime code-breaking, ballistics calculations, demonstrating that military necessity drove technological development that transformed civilian life. But this pattern raises questions. Why does war accelerate innovation? Could similar progress occur without military drivers? The war showed that massive investment, urgent need, organized effort could solve problems quickly, but required catastrophe as catalyst. Post-war, some innovation occurred through military spending, Internet's origins in ARPA projects, but civilian applications drove much progress. The relationship between military technology and civilian benefits remains complex, troubling, undeniable. Computing, emerging from war's necessities, transformed modern life more profoundly than almost any wartime technology, though nuclear weapons remain more dangerous, less beneficial legacy. Women's military service expanded beyond traditional nursing roles. Soviet Union integrated women into combat: pilots, snipers, tank commanders, infantry. Western militaries employed women in support roles: mechanics, drivers, radio operators, administrators. Women served in resistance movements: SOE agents, partisan fighters. American WASPs ferried aircraft domestically. British women operated anti-aircraft batteries, eventually engaging targets though officially classified as support personnel. Women demonstrated effectiveness under stress, challenging assumptions about women's capabilities, though encountering discrimination, harassment, inadequate equipment designed for men. After the war, most militaries reverted to excluding women from many roles, requiring decades of gradual change to reopen positions. Women veterans faced challenges: benefits often inferior to men's, contributions dismissed, experiences marginalized in histories focused on male combat. Gradually, women's service was recognized, studied, honored. Today, women serve in most military roles including combat, though integration remains incomplete, controversial in some societies. The war proved that women could serve effectively in virtually all capacities, that gender was a poor predictor of capability, that exclusion was based more on cultural assumptions than actual limitations. But translating that knowledge into policy change required generations, demonstrating that evidence doesn't automatically overcome prejudice, that social change is slow even when justified. The war's submarines hunted in Atlantic, Pacific, Mediterranean. German U-boats attempted to cut Britain's supply lines, nearly succeeding in 1942 when sinking ships faster than replacement. Wolf pack tactics, coordinating multiple submarines, overwhelmed convoys. But Allies responded with escort carriers, long-range patrol aircraft, improved depth charges, radar, breaking German codes. By 1943, U-boat losses became unsustainable. May 1943, Black May, saw 41 U-boats sunk. Kriegsmarine withdrew from North Atlantic. American submarines in Pacific devastated Japanese merchant fleet, isolating home islands, resource-producing territories, forward military bases. By 1945, Japan's merchant fleet was nearly destroyed. Oil couldn't reach refineries. Rice couldn't reach cities. American submarines contributed significantly to Japan's defeat. Submarines were dangerous service. German U-boat crews faced 75% casualty rate, highest of any German service. American submarine crews faced hazards from depth charges, mechanical failures, Japanese anti-submarine warfare. Submarine warfare raised ethical questions: torpedoing merchant ships, killing sailors who weren't combatants, continuing attacks after enemies surrendered. Both sides conducted unrestricted submarine warfare despite pre-war agreements. After the war, submarines gained nuclear propulsion, ballistic missiles, becoming strategic weapons platforms. The war demonstrated submarines' importance in naval warfare, commerce raiding, force projection. Submarine technology, tactics, doctrines developed during the war continue shaping naval competition today. The war's final year saw desperate measures, innovations born from desperation. Germany deployed jet fighters Me-262, too late and too few to affect outcomes. V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets attacked London, demonstrating guided missiles' potential but achieving little strategic effect. Japan employed kamikaze attacks, sacrificing pilots to damage American ships. Germany drafted old men and boys into Volkssturm militia. Japan planned Ketsugo, national mobilization to resist invasion. Both nations fought beyond rational hope, prolonging suffering, increasing casualties. Desperation produced technological innovation but couldn't overcome fundamental imbalances in resources, manpower, industrial capacity. The final year's fighting seemed senseless. Outcomes were determined, continuing only increased death tolls. But surrendering required facing defeat's finality, accepting consequences, abandoning ideologies that had sustained years of sacrifice. Leaders hesitated to admit failure, populations weren't prepared psychologically. Fighting continued until catastrophic events, Soviet conquest of Berlin, atomic bombs on Japan, made surrender unavoidable. The war's final year demonstrates that wars can continue long after outcomes are determined, that accepting defeat is difficult even when rational, that sunk cost fallacy operates at national scales, that stopping wars can be as hard as preventing them. Perhaps future conflicts could be shortened if participants recognized when outcomes were determined, but nationalism, pride, fear of consequences complicate such calculations. The war's end brought trials beyond Nuremberg and Tokyo. In France, collaborators faced epuration, purification, summary executions, imprisonments, public humiliations. Perhaps 10,000 were executed extrajudicially in liberation's immediate aftermath. Trials later sentenced 1,500 to death, though many sentences were commuted. In Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, similar processes occurred. In Eastern Europe under Soviet control, trials targeted not just war criminals but anti-communists, resistance members who might oppose new regimes. Trials served multiple purposes: justice for victims, removing threats to new orders, establishing legitimacy of new governments, satisfying populations' desire for revenge. But justice was inconsistent. Some guilty escaped, some innocent were punished. Political considerations influenced verdicts. Gradually, epuration ended as societies prioritized reconstruction over retribution, as practical need for experienced administrators outweighed purging compromised individuals. By 1950s, many collaborators had been amnestied, resumed normal lives. This pattern recurs after conflicts. Initial vengeance gives way to pragmatic accommodation, justice incomplete, victims feeling betrayed. Perhaps perfect justice after mass conflict is impossible. Too many perpetrators, too many victims, too many complicit bystanders. Societies must balance accountability with reconciliation, punishment with moving forward. The balance is never perfect, always contested, reflecting tensions between justice demands and stability needs. The war's art created during conflict captured immediacy, emotion, propaganda's influence, artists' responses to surrounding chaos. Soviet posters called for defense of motherland, emphasizing heroic resistance. American Norman Rockwell painted four freedoms, idealizing war's purposes. British artists like Paul Nash depicted bombed landscapes. German artist Otto Dix painted war's horrors. Picasso's Guernica, painted before the war, became symbol of bombing's horror. Concentration camp survivors created art documenting atrocities. After the war, artists continued grappling with its meanings. Some created realistic depictions, others abstract works expressing psychological trauma. Holocaust art formed distinct genre, preserving memory, bearing witness, expressing inexpressible. War photography matured. Robert Capa, Margaret Bourke-White, others documented combat, liberation, devastation. Their images became iconic, shaping public memory. But photography's relation to truth was complex. Staged photos, censored images, propaganda purposes. After the war, art about the war evolved across generations. Immediate experiences gave way to reflection, commemoration, reinterpretation. Each generation found new meanings, emphases. Contemporary art still engages the war, suggesting its continuing resonance. Unfinished business, persistent questions. Art's role in processing collective trauma, preserving memory, warning future generations remains essential, providing emotional, moral dimensions that historical analysis alone cannot capture. The war's medical experiments included horrific atrocities. Nazi doctors' experiments on prisoners, Japanese Unit 731's biological warfare tests using prisoners. These constituted crimes against humanity, torturing and killing thousands while producing little scientifically valuable data. After the war, Nuremberg trials prosecuted Nazi doctors, establishing Nuremberg Code governing human experimentation ethics, informed consent, voluntary participation, no unnecessary suffering. But some perpetrators escaped justice. Unit 731 doctors received immunity from prosecution in exchange for providing data to American authorities. This raised disturbing questions about whether knowledge gained through atrocities should be used, whether using it validates crimes, whether destroying it wastes suffering that occurred. Most ethicists argue that data from unethical experiments should not be used, that doing so signals acceptance of methods, encourages future atrocities, dishonors victims. But some argue that not using data wastes suffering, that benefiting humanity partially redeems evil. These debates remain relevant for contemporary research ethics. When is research unethical? What constitutes informed consent? How to balance knowledge advancement with protecting participants. The war's medical atrocities shocked consciences, established ethical frameworks still guiding research. But implementation remains imperfect. Subsequent research scandals show that ethical violations continue. The war taught that scientific progress cannot justify any means, that ethics must constrain research, that humanity's protection matters more than knowledge advancement. The question remains whether violence on the war's scale could occur again. Optimists note developments since 1945, United Nations, international law, nuclear deterrence, economic interdependence, democratic governance expansion, human rights norms. These potentially prevent wars between major powers, make aggression costly, provide conflict resolution mechanisms. Pessimists note persistent war tendencies, nationalism, authoritarianism's resurgence, economic inequality, climate change stresses, nuclear proliferation, cyber warfare, terrorism. They argue human nature hasn't changed, that circumstances could again produce catastrophic conflict, that complacency is dangerous. Perhaps both perspectives contain truth. The specific conditions producing World War II, interwar instability, totalitarian ideologies, appeasement failures, are unlikely to recur exactly. But different conditions could produce similar catastrophes. Nuclear weapons make great power war potentially civilization-ending, possibly deterring but also creating catastrophic risks. Regional conflicts continue, some escalating, though not yet producing global wars. The war's lessons suggest vigilance is perpetual requirement, that peace requires active maintenance, that preventing wars requires addressing their root causes: economic instability, authoritarianism, nationalism, territorial disputes. Whether humanity has learned enough from the war's horror to prevent repetition remains open question. Answer depending on choices made today and tomorrow, requiring each generation's commitment to peace, justice, human rights, international cooperation. The war's weather impacted operations profoundly. D-Day was delayed due to storms, launched during brief weather window. Russian winters froze German advances, aided Soviet defenses. Monsoons in Asia halted operations seasonally. Fog at Ardennes helped German surprise attack. Clear weather allowed air operations. Clouds grounded planes. Commanders planned around weather, sought advantages from it, were sometimes defeated by it despite planning. Weather forecasting improved during the war, better understanding of meteorology, more observations, forecasts informing decisions. But prediction remained imperfect. Weather still surprised, frustrated, aided different sides unpredictably. After the war, weather forecasting advanced further using computers, satellites, sophisticated models. But weather remains a factor in military operations, limiting what forces can accomplish, imposing delays, creating opportunities. The war demonstrated that nature constrains even modern militaries, that technological sophistication doesn't fully overcome environmental factors, that weather is neutral party influencing all sides, that sometimes natural forces matter more than human capabilities. Perhaps there's humility in recognizing environmental limits on human ambitions, that even vast industrial mobilizations can't control everything, that accepting constraints is wisdom, not weakness. The war's weather reminds us that humans operate within nature, not above it, that environmental factors shape outcomes regardless of planning. The war's end left questions about collaboration's nature, resistance's costs, survival's compromises. In occupied territories, spectrum existed between heroic resistance and active collaboration, with most people somewhere between, accommodating occupation while not actively helping, trying to survive, occasionally helping resistance when safe, occasionally cooperating with occupiers when necessary. After liberation, judgments were harsh. Resistors celebrated, collaborators punished, those in middle judged by which way they leaned. But lived reality was complex. Someone who collaborated administratively might have saved lives through their position. Someone celebrated as resistor might have been ineffective, endangering others through recklessness. The moral clarity of good versus evil, which did characterize the war overall, Nazism was evil, defeating it was necessary, became muddied at individual level, where survival, protection of family, fear, ambition, principle all influenced choices in ways outsiders couldn't fully understand. Perhaps the lesson is avoiding simplistic judgments while maintaining moral clarity about overall causes. The war was just cause, Nazism had to be defeated. But within that framework, individuals made choices under impossible circumstances, some admirably, some shamefully, most somewhere between. Understanding requires acknowledging this complexity without losing sight of larger moral truths. Humans are capable of both heroism and cowardice, often simultaneously, and judging from safety and distance requires humility. The war's museums and memorials serve educational purposes, preserving memory for generations without direct experience. Holocaust museums like Yad Vashem, United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Auschwitz-Birkenau preserve evidence, educate about genocide, honor victims. Military museums display equipment, documents, personal items. Memorials provide spaces for contemplation, mourning, remembrance. Each serves different purposes, some educational, some commemorative, some cautionary. Debates occur about how to present history. Graphic images versus tasteful restraint, national triumph versus universal suffering, heroes versus victims, simple narratives versus complexity. Museums evolve. Early post-war museums emphasized national glory. Later museums incorporated diverse perspectives, acknowledged ambiguities, included former enemies' experiences. Memorial design reflects values. Vietnam Veterans Memorial's stark simplicity contrasts with triumphal monuments elsewhere. How societies remember war through museums and memorials reveals priorities, values, relationship with past. Memorials ask visitors what the war means, how to honor dead without glorifying war, how to remember suffering without dwelling on it, how to learn lessons without imposing present values on past. These questions have no perfect answers, but asking them is essential for thoughtful engagement with history. Museums and memorials are where history becomes public, where education occurs, where memory is shaped for future generations. Their importance cannot be overstated. The war's children who survived became adults shaped by experiences. Holocaust survivors carried trauma lifelong, many never speaking of experiences until old age. Children who lost parents grew up feeling that absence. Evacuees remembered displacement, separation, sometimes abuse. Children who experienced bombing, invasion, combat carried memories affecting mental health, relationships, worldview. Child development research shows trauma during formative years has lasting impacts. Difficulty trusting, forming relationships, regulating emotions, managing stress. Yet many survivors showed remarkable resilience, building lives, raising families, contributing to society. Some became advocates for peace, human rights, Holocaust education. Others withdrew, struggled silently. Each person processed trauma differently, influenced by support received, innate resilience, subsequent life experiences. The war's child victims demonstrate that trauma's effects last generations, that supporting survivors requires long-term commitment, that resilience is possible but shouldn't be assumed, that societies have obligations toward those traumatized by conflicts. Today, wars continue traumatizing children: Syrian war, Yemen, Afghanistan, Ukraine. The war's lessons about children's vulnerability, trauma's persistence, support's importance remain relevant but often unheeded. Protecting children requires preventing wars, and when wars occur, providing support, refuge, rehabilitation. Failure to apply these lessons means continuing to traumatize children, perpetuating cycles of violence, pain, dysfunction. The war's censorship controlled information, shaped public understanding, maintained morale, concealed difficulties, exaggerated successes. Governments controlled press, monitored communications, censored letters, prohibited sensitive information dissemination. In democracies, voluntary censorship operated alongside official controls. News organizations agreed to withhold information that might help enemies, damage morale. Censorship served military security, preventing intelligence from reaching enemies, and political purposes, maintaining public support, concealing failures, manipulating perceptions. After the war, when censored information emerged, publics sometimes felt betrayed, lied to, manipulated. This contributed to credibility gaps in subsequent conflicts, Vietnam particularly, where public skepticism about official narratives reflected lessons learned during the war. The tension between security needs and democratic transparency remains unresolved. Wars require secrecy, operational security, morale maintenance. But democracies value truth, free press, informed citizenry. Balancing these creates difficult choices. The war showed that extensive censorship is possible even in democracies under existential threat. It also showed that censorship's effects outlast wars, that publics remember being manipulated, that restoring credibility after wartime deception is difficult. Perhaps the lesson is that necessary secrecy should be minimal, temporary, justified, that governments should err toward transparency, that democracy's strength lies in informed citizens who can handle truth, however unpleasant. The war's legacy includes questions about memory, responsibility, lessons, meaning. What should future generations remember? How to honor victims without glorifying war. How to teach lessons without imposing interpretations. How to remember atrocities without creating despair. These questions don't have universal answers. Each society, generation, individual answers differently based on values, experiences, concerns. But asking them is essential. Memory fades, veterans die, survivors pass, direct witnesses disappear. Soon, no one alive will remember the war personally. Memory will be mediated through history, museums, memorials, films, books. This transition from living memory to historical memory changes remembrance's nature. Less immediate, more interpretable, potentially more subject to manipulation or myth-making. Historians' responsibility increases to preserve accuracy, complexity, multiple perspectives, to resist simplification, mythologizing, weaponizing history for present political purposes. Citizens' responsibility includes engaging history thoughtfully, teaching younger generations, applying lessons wisely, maintaining vigilance against forces that produced the war. Authoritarianism, nationalism, bigotry, violence. The war's greatest legacy might be a reminder of civilization's fragility, humanity's capacity for both good and evil, necessity of choosing consciously which to nurture. These remain relevant in fundamentally changed world. The war is past, but its questions persist, demanding each generation's attention, reflection, choices. The war's resistance to simple narratives frustrates desire for clear lessons. It was simultaneously just war against evil and horrific catastrophe, necessary conflict and preventable tragedy, triumph of democracy and demonstration of humanity's self-destructive tendencies, victory of good over evil and conflict where all sides committed atrocities. These contradictions cannot be resolved. They reflect reality's complexity. Attempts to impose simple narratives, purely heroic or purely tragic, distort understanding. The war was both and neither, transcending categories, resisting neat conclusions. This complexity frustrates but also enriches. It demands nuanced thinking, acknowledging tensions, accepting ambiguities. It requires holding multiple truths simultaneously, that defeating Nazism was necessary moral imperative and that methods employed raise ethical questions, that soldiers showed incredible courage and that war traumatized them, that civilians endured nobly and that survival required compromises, that technological progress occurred and that it served destruction. Perhaps the war's ultimate lesson is that reality resists simplification, that holding complexity is difficult but necessary, that easy answers are usually wrong, that wisdom requires accepting uncertainty, tension, paradox. This applies beyond the war. Contemporary challenges also resist simple solutions, require nuanced thinking, demand acknowledging trade-offs. The war teaches not specific policy lessons but intellectual humility, moral seriousness, recognition of complexity, willingness to grapple with difficult questions without false certainty. The war's shadow extends over subsequent generations, shaping worldviews, politics, international relations, culture, individual psychologies. Baby boomers grew up in war's aftermath, prosperity built on parents' sacrifices, Cold War tensions rooted in wartime alliances' dissolution, civil rights movements partly inspired by contradictions between fighting fascist racism while maintaining domestic segregation. Generation X inherited Cold War anxieties, questioned parents' narratives, watched veterans age and die. Millennials learned about the war from survivors' final testimonies, museums, films, saw last veterans commemorated. Generation Z inherits a world where the war is history, not living memory, yet still shaping institutions, borders, alliances, technologies, values. Each generation relates to the war differently, immediate aftermaths, trauma, and reconstruction. 1960s questioning of authority informed by contrast between wartime propaganda and reality. 1990s triumphalism after Cold War's end suggesting democracy had won. 2000s present recognition that the war's lessons weren't fully learned, that authoritarianism, genocide, aggressive war continue. The war's relevance persists because it addressed fundamental questions about human nature, civilization's fragility, democracy versus dictatorship, nationalism's dangers, international cooperation's necessity, technology's double-edged nature. These remain contemporary concerns. The war provides historical examples, cautionary tales, inspiration, warning. Each generation must interpret these for itself, applying lessons to new contexts, hopefully learning enough to prevent repetition while recognizing that history doesn't repeat exactly, that vigilance is perpetual requirement. The war's commemoration reflects tensions between honor and critique, remembrance and myth-making, patriotism and pacifism, victory and victimhood. Some commemorations emphasize military heroism, national triumph, justified sacrifice. Others emphasize civilian suffering, war's futility, peace's importance. Some focus on Holocaust as unique evil requiring prevention. Others include other victims, Soviet citizens, Roma, disabled, LGBT+ people, civilians killed by all sides. Disagreements occur about what to remember, how to remember, who has authority to speak for dead, whether emphasis should be sacrificing or warning. These tensions are healthy. Multiple perspectives prevent single narrative dominance, encourage thinking, reflect democracy's pluralism. But they also create conflicts, veterans feeling disrespected by anti-war messages, Holocaust survivors arguing their experiences are being diluted, nations disputing blame and credit. Perhaps no single commemoration can satisfy all. Different people need different things from remembrance. Veterans may need honor, recognition, community. Pacifists may need warning, cautionary tale. Victims' families may need acknowledgement, justice, memory preservation. Educators may need complexity, nuance, lessons. Ideally, commemorations accommodate multiple needs, allowing different people to find what they seek while challenging them to consider other perspectives. The war's commemoration, like its history, resists simple formulas, requiring instead ongoing negotiation, reflection, adaptation as contexts change and needs evolve. The question that haunts is whether humanity learned enough. The war demonstrated authoritarianism's dangers, appeasement's failures, genocide's horror, total war's catastrophe, nuclear weapons' apocalyptic threat. These lessons shaped post-war institutions, United Nations, NATO, European Union, non-proliferation treaties, human rights frameworks. They informed education, political culture, international norms. But have they prevented recurrence? Genocide occurred in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia. Authoritarianism resurges globally. Nuclear proliferation continues. Wars persist, though not yet matching WWII's scale. Perhaps learning from history is too simple concept. Lessons aren't permanently learned but must be retaught each generation, reapplied in new contexts, defended against those who didn't learn or forgot or reject them. The war's survivors pass, memory fades, distance increases, lessons seem less urgent. New generations face different challenges, question old certainties, sometimes repeat mistakes. But they also build on progress, international institutions stronger than ever, human rights more recognized than in 1945, genocide at least condemned universally even if not always prevented. The war created frameworks for progress while demonstrating how fragile progress is, how quickly it can reverse, how eternal vigilance really is freedom's price. Perhaps the measure of learning isn't preventing all wars, atrocities, authoritarianism, human nature and geopolitics make that unlikely. but rather creating structures, norms, reflexes that make them harder, less devastating, more likely to be resisted. By that standard, humanity has learned something, though not enough, with much work remaining. The war's environmental impact included destroyed forests, contaminated land, damaged ecosystems, resource depletion. Bombing created craters, destroyed vegetation, contaminated soil with chemicals, explosives. Battles devastated landscapes. Forests reduced to matchsticks, fields cratered, waterways polluted. Some areas remained contaminated decades later. Unexploded ordnance, chemical residues, destroyed infrastructure. Resource extraction for war industries depleted forests, mines, fisheries. Post-war reconstruction required further resources. The war demonstrated that modern conflicts devastate environments, that total war treats nature as resource to exploit or obstacle to destroy. Environmental recovery took decades, some damage permanent. Post-war, environmental impacts of military activities gained attention, nuclear testing's fallout, bases contamination, weapons environmental costs. Environmental concerns now factor into military planning, weapons design, though military activities remain environmentally damaging. The war showed that human conflicts harm broader ecosystems, that environmental destruction accompanies political destruction, that sustainability requires peace. Climate change now adds dimension, resource scarcity, migration, instability potentially triggering conflicts. The war's environmental lessons suggest that ecology and security are intertwined, that protecting environment is security issue, that sustainable peace requires environmental stewardship. But these lessons are imperfectly applied. Military environmental impacts continue. Environmental security connections are inadequately addressed. The war's environmental legacy includes not just physical damage but recognition, still developing, that environmental and human security are inseparable, that protecting both requires coordinated effort, that wars harm not just humanity but ecosystems supporting life. The war's animals suffered largely forgotten, horses used for transport, dogs for messages and guard duty, pigeons carrying communications, animals used for experiments, pets abandoned or killed, livestock destroyed, wildlife devastated by battles. Millions of horses died. Mules carried supplies over impossible terrain. Dogs detected mines, protected soldiers, provided companionship. Animals had no understanding of causes, no choice in participation, yet suffered, died, endured alongside humans. After the war, some animals received recognition, monuments to animals in war, Animals Victoria Cross, stories of particular animals preserved. But most died anonymously, uncounted, unmemorialized. Animal suffering in war reflects broader issues about animal ethics, humanity's relationship with other species, power dynamics allowing humans to sacrifice animals for human purposes. Contemporary military use of animals continues, though reduced. Military working dogs, mine-detecting rats, dolphins for naval purposes. Each use raises ethical questions about consent, treatment, justification. The war's animal victims remind that conflicts harm all living things, that moral consideration extends beyond humanity, that compassion includes other species. But practical applications remain limited. Wartime necessity typically overrides animal welfare. Non-human suffering receives minimal attention compared to human. Perhaps someday humanity will extend ethical consideration more fully to animals, recognizing their interests, limiting their use, avoiding their suffering. The war's animal victims, forgotten by most, await such recognition, their sacrifice unacknowledged but not less real than human losses. The war's end brought displaced emotions, relief at survival, grief for dead, guilt about surviving when others didn't, uncertainty about future, trauma's ongoing effects, difficulty resuming normal life. Soldiers struggled with civilian transition. Combat's intensity made normal life seem empty, purposeless. Survivors faced challenges, rebuilding lives, coping with trauma, finding meaning, dealing with loss. Societies struggled integrating returning service members, acknowledging civilians' suffering, addressing collaboration, punishment, moving forward while honoring past. The transition from war to peace proved psychologically difficult. War's clarity, intensity, purpose gave way to peacetime ambiguity, normalcy, questions about meaning. Some veterans missed combat's camaraderie despite horrors. Civilians who survived faced survivors' guilt, traumatic memories, losses that defined subsequent lives. The war didn't end on VE or VJ Day for individuals. It continued in nightmares, grief, trauma, physical wounds requiring decades of recovery or never healing. Recognizing that war's psychological consequences outlast fighting is important. Supporting survivors requires long-term commitment, understanding that trauma doesn't end with peace treaties. Modern understanding of PTSD, trauma, resilience traces partly to World War II experiences, though understanding remained primitive then. Today's veterans benefit from better support, though still inadequate. The war taught that physical survival isn't enough. Psychological survival matters equally, requires attention, resources, compassion. This lesson applies to contemporary conflicts. Ending fighting is necessary but insufficient. Peace requires addressing war's psychological legacies, supporting those trying to rebuild lives after catastrophe. The war's turning points weren't always recognized as such when occurring. D-Day participants didn't know they were beginning Europe's liberation. They focused on surviving beaches, completing objectives. Stalingrad's defenders didn't know their battle would be celebrated as turning point. They endured suffering, hoping to survive another day. Pearl Harbor's significance wasn't immediately clear. Americans were shocked but couldn't know the war's eventual scale. Only retrospect reveals turning points. When outcomes become clear, trajectories evident. This suggests humility about contemporary judgments. We cannot know what events will prove decisive, what decisions will matter most, what moments will define our time. Living through history differs from studying it. The present is uncertain, contingent, unpredictable. The past seems inevitable only because we know what happened. For those living it, future was unknown. Possibilities seemed endless, outcomes uncertain. The war's history, told retrospectively with knowledge of outcomes, risks distorting understanding of how it felt living through uncertainty. Perhaps when studying history, we should remember that nothing was predetermined, that different choices might have produced different outcomes, that historical actors faced genuine uncertainty, that events seemed different to contemporaries than to us. This recognition makes history more human, less deterministic, acknowledges agency, contingency, unpredictability that shape human experience. It suggests that our present, similarly uncertain, holds possibilities we can't foresee, that choices matter even when outcomes remain unknown, that history is made by people making decisions under uncertainty, not by inevitable forces beyond human influence. The war's museums face challenges. Preserving artifacts deteriorating with age, recording survivors' testimonies before too late, making history relevant to generations increasingly distant from events, balancing commemoration with education, addressing contested interpretations, incorporating new perspectives, engaging visitors emotionally while maintaining accuracy, using technology effectively without overshadowing content. Museums evolve constantly, adding exhibits on previously marginalized participants, updating interpretations based on scholarship, incorporating interactive elements, addressing contemporary relevance. Debates occur about appropriate representation. Should exhibits shock with graphic images or respect sensibilities? Should focus be national or international, military or civilian, political or personal? Each museum makes choices reflecting priorities, audience, resources, cultural context. Best museums balance multiple objectives, honoring participants, educating visitors, preserving memory, warning about war's dangers, celebrating courage, acknowledging complexity, maintaining accuracy, engaging emotionally. Visiting war museums can be a profound experience, connecting with history through artifacts, stories, images, confronting evil, suffering, courage, reflecting on contemporary relevance, feeling gratitude for peace. But museums can also mislead through selective presentation, nationalist bias, simplification, manipulation. Critical engagement is necessary, questioning narratives, seeking multiple perspectives, recognizing that museums make choices about what to show, how to interpret. The war's museological representation influences public memory, shapes how generations understand the war, affects lessons learned. Museums bear responsibility to represent history thoughtfully, honestly, complexly, recognizing that their work shapes not just understanding of past but attitudes toward present and future. The war's literature for children poses particular challenges. How to explain genocide to children. How to convey war's horror without traumatizing. How to teach lessons without indoctrinating. How to balance age-appropriateness with honesty. Children's books about the war range from sanitized adventure stories to age-appropriate treatments of Holocaust, resistance, survival. Best children's books respect children's capacity to understand serious topics while presenting information age-appropriately, acknowledging complexity without overwhelming, inspiring without preaching, teaching without traumatizing. Books like Number the Stars, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. Diary adaptations present the war to children, introducing concepts like persecution, resistance, moral choice. They serve important educational purposes, teaching empathy, alertness to injustice, courage, historical awareness. But they also simplify necessarily, sometimes creating problematic narratives. Heroic Gentiles rescuing helpless Jews, children as innocent observers rather than actors, evil as obvious rather than banal. Teaching children about the war requires balancing honesty with protection, complexity with clarity, memory with hope. Perhaps the goal isn't comprehensive understanding, impossible for children, but rather foundation for later learning, moral framework emphasizing compassion, justice, courage, critical thinking. Children who learn about the war appropriately develop awareness of history's darkness and light, human capacity for both evil and goodness, importance of choosing rightly when faced with moral questions. This serves them throughout lives, informing values, choices, citizenship. The war's educational legacy includes teaching younger generations, ensuring memory persists, lessons continue informing future choices. The war's economic miracle in defeated nations, particularly West Germany and Japan, demonstrated that Reconstruction could succeed, that former enemies could become allies, that prosperity could follow devastation. Multiple factors enabled this: Marshall Plan aid, American occupation policies promoting democracy and capitalism, Cold War dynamics encouraging Western support, domestic factors including skilled populations, strong work ethics, social cohesion, focus on rebuilding. Both nations transformed from militarist dictatorships to prosperous democracies, from wartime enemies to American allies, from devastated ruins to economic powerhouses. This success suggested that post-conflict reconstruction could work given adequate support, wise policies, favorable conditions. It informed subsequent reconstruction efforts, though rarely with similar success. Bosnia, Afghanistan, Iraq faced different challenges, received less sustained support, achieved less dramatic transformations. The German and Japanese experiences suggest that generous reconstruction assistance, democratic political development, economic integration, long-term commitment can produce positive outcomes even after devastating conflicts. But they also suggest that success requires multiple favorable factors aligning. Not all conflicts offer similar opportunities. The war's economic legacy includes not just destruction but also proof that recovery is possible, that former enemies can reconcile, that reconstruction can succeed. This offers hope for contemporary conflicts, suggesting that post-war futures needn't be predetermined by wartime animosity, that peace dividends can exceed war costs, that building is possible after destruction. But it also sets perhaps unrealistic standards. German and Japanese reconstruction succeeded partly due to unique circumstances unlikely to recur exactly, suggesting caution about expecting similar outcomes elsewhere without comparable commitments. Conditions. The war's spies included extraordinary individuals: Nancy Wake, White Mouse, evaded Gestapo, organized resistance, led thousands. Virginia Hall operated in occupied France despite prosthetic leg, eventually led OSS operations. Odette Sansom endured torture, refused to betray colleagues, survived Ravensbrück. Richard Sorge spied for Soviets from Tokyo, provided crucial intelligence about Japanese intentions, German invasion plans. These and countless others risked everything, operated under extreme danger, contributed to victory. Some were caught, tortured, executed. Some survived but couldn't speak about their work for decades. Some received recognition eventually, Others remained anonymous. Espionage work required courage, intelligence, improvisation, ability to deceive convincingly, accept loneliness, live with constant danger. Spies operated without support system. Soldiers had no units, comrades, visible recognition. They were alone, knowing capture meant torture, execution, unable to share burdens. After the war, many struggled adjusting. Secrecy habits persisted, trauma remained unaddressed, contributions unrecognized. Gradually, declassification revealed intelligence's importance. Specific agents' stories emerged. Books, films celebrated spies, though often romanticizing work that was mostly tedious, terrifying, lonely. Spies' contributions to victory were significant. Intelligence shortened the war, saved lives, enabled victories. But spies themselves paid high costs: psychological strain, danger, post-war obscurity. They deserve recognition alongside combat veterans. Their courage acknowledged, sacrifices honored, contributions to victory remembered alongside more visible military operations. Their stories remind that wars are won not just on battlefields but in shadows, by individuals whose names often remain unknown but whose contributions were essential. The war's codebreakers, cryptanalysts, linguists, translators enabled intelligence operations, broke enemy codes, intercepted communications, translated documents, interpreted signals. Bletchley Park employed thousands, mathematicians, linguists, clerks, working to break Enigma, other German codes. Similar operations existed in America, decrypting Japanese codes, enabling Pacific victories. Soviet codebreakers worked on German codes. German codebreakers had some successes against Allied codes. Codebreaking was intellectual work, solving puzzles, identifying patterns, applying mathematics, exploiting mistakes. It required intelligence, persistence, creativity, teamwork. Security was paramount. Information leaks could compromise operations, cost lives, alert enemies their codes were broken. Codebreakers worked under pressure. Lives depended on their speed, accuracy. Success provided decisive intelligence, German U-boat positions, Japanese fleet movements, strategic intentions. But success had to remain secret. Using intelligence without revealing sources required care, deception, accepting sometimes that intelligence couldn't be acted on without compromising its source. After the war, codebreaking's importance remained classified for decades. Alan Turing and colleagues received no public recognition during lifetimes. When revelations came, codebreakers' contributions were finally acknowledged. Their role in shortening the war, saving lives recognized. Their story demonstrates that intelligence work, unglamorous and invisible, matters decisively. It also shows that securing credit for contributions sometimes requires decades, that invisibility is sometimes necessary price for effectiveness, that recognition, however delayed, eventually comes, that history records contributions even when contemporaries don't acknowledge them. The war's POWs experienced varied conditions depending on captor. Western Allied prisoners in German camps faced hardship, inadequate food, cold, boredom, occasional brutality, but generally survived. German prisoners in Western hands faced similar conditions. But Eastern Front POWs faced nightmare. German treatment of Soviet prisoners was genocidal. 3 million died from starvation, exposure, execution. Soviet treatment of German prisoners was brutal, hundreds of thousands died. Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners was systematically cruel. Forced labor, starvation, beatings, medical experiments, death marches. Death rates for Allied prisoners of Japan exceeded 30% compared to 4% in German camps. Japanese cultural attitudes toward surrender, viewing it as disgrace, contributed to brutal treatment of those who surrendered. After the war, surviving POWs struggled, physical damage from malnutrition, disease, injuries, psychological trauma from captivity, helplessness, witnessing atrocities, readjustment difficulties. Some POWs formed lasting bonds with fellow prisoners, found meaning in endurance, mutual support. Others struggled with bitterness, trauma, feeling that suffering was dismissed, unacknowledged. POW experiences varied enormously. Some found captivity relatively tolerable, maintained hope. Others endured hell, barely survived, carried scars permanently. Their stories demonstrate war's capacity to degrade, dehumanize, torture, but also human resilience, capacity for maintaining dignity under degradation, supporting each other through horror, surviving when survival seemed impossible. POWs deserve recognition. They endured, survived, came home when many didn't. Their experiences remind that war involves not just combat but captivity, that protecting prisoners is moral imperative, that POW treatment reveals much about society's values, human decency under stress. The war's aftermath saw efforts to address trauma, provide support, reintegrate veterans and survivors. But resources were inadequate, understanding limited, priorities focused on physical reconstruction rather than psychological recovery. Veterans struggled with trauma, often self-medicating with alcohol, suffering silently, withdrawing from families. Concentration camp survivors faced particular challenges: physical damage, psychological trauma, loss of families, communities, homes, identities. Many emigrated, sought fresh starts, carried trauma silently into new lives. Children who survived faced developmental challenges, attachment difficulties, ongoing effects of childhood trauma. Gradually, understanding improved, PTSD was recognized. Though not named until 1980, trauma treatment developed, support groups formed. But progress was slow, many suffered without effective help. Post-war decades saw suicide rates, mental health problems, substance abuse among survivors, effects passing to subsequent generations. Children of survivors often experience secondary trauma, absorbed parents' unprocessed pain. Today's understanding suggests that trauma requires immediate, sustained intervention, that psychological wounds need treatment like physical ones, that societies have obligations toward trauma survivors. But even today, resources are inadequate, stigma persists, many suffer without help. The war taught that victory requires not just winning battles but supporting those who fought and endured, that civilization's measure includes how it treats traumatized members, that psychological recovery matters as much as physical, that memory of suffering should inspire commitment to helping those who suffer. These lessons are slowly being learned, imperfectly applied, requiring ongoing advocacy, resources, social commitment. The war's legacy in science and technology transformed modern life. Nuclear power, jet aircraft, computers, radar, rockets, plastics, antibiotics, countless other innovations emerged from wartime research. These technologies, refined post-war, created prosperity, convenience, medical advances, communication revolutions. But they also created threats: nuclear weapons, pollution, surveillance capabilities, potential for destructive use. Technology is morally neutral. Potential for good or evil depends on application. The war demonstrated this dramatically. Scientific advances saved lives, improved conditions, but also enabled unprecedented killing. Post-war, scientists grappled with responsibilities. Should they refuse military work? Could they control applications? What were ethical limits? Some became arms control advocates: Einstein, Oppenheimer. Others warned against nuclear proliferation, advocated international control. Others continued weapons work, believing deterrence required technological superiority, that restraint would be exploited. These debates continue. Scientists working on artificial intelligence, biotechnology, cyber capabilities face similar questions about responsibility, dual use, unintended consequences. The war established that science is not value-neutral activity conducted in ivory towers but force-shaping societies, requiring ethical reflection, that scientists cannot disclaim responsibility for applications, that knowledge creation carries moral weight. How societies manage scientific advance, channel it toward beneficial purposes, prevent destructive use remains challenge. The war accelerated science spectacularly, demonstrating what focused effort could achieve. Whether that acceleration was worth its costs, whether similar progress could occur without war, whether humanity can manage technologies it creates are questions the war raised but didn't answer, leaving them for subsequent generations to grapple with as technologies grow more powerful, stakes higher, margins for error smaller. The war's resistance movements demonstrated ordinary people's capacity for extraordinary courage. Resistors risked torture, execution, families' destruction to fight occupation, help allies, maintain hope. They were teachers, farmers, students, workers, priests, doctors, people with normal lives who chose danger over safety, principle over survival. Some resistance was armed sabotage, guerrilla warfare, assassinations. Some was nonviolent, underground press, intelligence gathering, helping Jews escape, maintaining national culture. All was dangerous. Occupiers responded brutally to resistance, executing not just resistors but hostages, relatives, entire villages. Yet resistance continued, motivated by patriotism, hatred of occupation, moral conviction that some things are worth dying for, hope that contributions mattered, refusal to accept oppression passively. Resistance effectiveness is debatable, military impact was often limited, casualties were high, reprisals terrible. But moral impact was significant. Resistance maintained national spirit, provided rallying points, created heroes, established that occupation was opposed, offered alternative to collaboration or passivity. After liberation, resistance provided legitimacy. Resistance credentials opened political careers, shaped national narratives, created myths sometimes exceeding reality. But genuine resistors deserve honor. They chose courage when conformity was safer, stood against overwhelming power, maintained humanity when barbarism ruled. Their legacy reminds that individuals can resist tyranny, that collective action matters, that courage is possible even when odds are impossible, that some people will always fight for freedom regardless of costs. This is inspiring but also cautionary. Resistance cannot be demanded. Risks are real. Not everyone can be hero. Survival is valid choice. But resistors demonstrate that heroism is possible, that some will always resist, that tyranny never goes unopposed, that human spirit, however battered, endures. The war's questions persist. Why did it happen? Could it have been prevented? Was it inevitable? What were alternatives? How could civilized nations descend to such barbarism? Why did people participate in, tolerate, or ignore atrocities? What responsibilities do citizens have when governments commit evil? When is violence justified? What are war's legitimate limits? How should defeated enemies be treated? Can peace be lasting? Will humans repeat such catastrophe? These questions lack definitive answers, but asking them is essential. They force examination of human nature, political systems, moral choices, historical processes. They resist simplistic responses, require nuanced thinking, acknowledge complexity. Perhaps the war's greatest lesson is that important questions don't have easy answers, that grappling with complexity is necessary even when uncomfortable, that certainty is dangerous, that humility is wisdom. The war teaches that humans are capable of both extraordinary evil and goodness, that circumstances matter, that choices have consequences, that vigilance is necessary, that values must be defended, that international cooperation matters, that democracy requires maintenance, that tyranny is ever possible, that genocide requires active prevention, that peace is fragile achievement requiring constant work. These lessons aren't easily summarized, don't fit bumper stickers, require ongoing engagement. Perhaps that's appropriate. The war was too vast, too complex, too important to reduce to simple slogans. It demands continued study, reflection, application of lessons to new contexts, recognition that its questions remain relevant, that each generation must answer them anew, that forgetting is dangerous, that remembering, however painful, is necessary obligation to those who suffered, died, fought, survived, endured the war's horrors, hoping future generations would learn enough to prevent repetition. The war created modern world, for better and worse, reshaping international order, technology, society, consciousness. We inherit that world, living with its structures, institutions, technologies, problems, possibilities. Understanding the war is understanding ourselves, our world's origins, presence, roots, challenges, histories. The war demonstrated humanity's capacity for destruction but also resilience, evil but also resistance, hatred but also solidarity. It showed that civilization is fragile but also renewable, that progress is possible but reversible, that democracy requires defense, that rights require protection, that peace requires work. These lessons remain relevant as authoritarianism resurges, nationalism intensifies, climate change threatens, nuclear weapons proliferate, technology advances, Inequalities persist. The war's relevance isn't diminishing but increasing as distance allows perspective, as new challenges echo old patterns, as questions it raised remain unanswered. Perhaps the war's ultimate lesson is that history matters, that understanding past is necessary for navigating present, creating future, that those who ignore history risk repeating it, that remembering isn't dwelling on past but informing present, that the dead speak through history if we listen, that their suffering shouldn't be meaningless, that learning from catastrophe might prevent the next. The war was humanity's darkest hour, revealing capacities for evil that remain terrifying. But it also showed capacities for courage, sacrifice, resilience, reconstruction, reconciliation that inspire hope. 75 years later, the war remains reference point for scale of catastrophe, depth of evil, height of courage, possibility of recovery, importance of choice. Its memory is gift to future, terrible warning, inspiring example, complex legacy demanding engagement. What we do with that gift determines whether suffering was meaningful, whether lessons were learned, whether the next generation inherits better world than the war's generation endured. The war's veterans are dying, last survivors passing, direct memory ending, transition from living history to written history accelerating. Soon, no one alive will remember Pearl Harbor, D-Day, Hiroshima. Memory will be entirely mediated through recordings, documents, museums, histories, films, photographs. This transition is both loss and opportunity. Loss of direct connection, personal testimony, embodied memory. Opportunity to consolidate lessons, achieve perspective, escape mythologizing that sometimes surrounds living veterans, assess more dispassionately. But the transition also risks forgetting. When witnesses die, memories fade, urgency diminishes, lessons seem less relevant. History becomes abstract rather than personal. Combat veterans carried authority. Their experiences lent weight to war warnings, peace advocacy, moral testimony. Survivors bore witness to atrocity, making Holocaust denial harder, genocide's reality undeniable. As they die, responsibility shifts to historians, educators, citizens to maintain memory, teach lessons, apply wisdom. This requires active effort, preserving recordings, maintaining museums, teaching history, visiting memorials, reading testimonies, watching films, engaging students, combating denialism, resisting mythologizing, acknowledging complexity. It requires recognizing that the war's importance doesn't diminish with time, that its lessons remain applicable, that forgetting enables repetition, that memory is responsibility, active choice, moral obligation. The dying of veterans marks transition, from war as lived experience to war as history, from personal memory to collective memory, from witnesses' testimony to historians' interpretation. This transition is inevitable but not passive. How societies manage it, what memories are preserved, which lessons are emphasized, how history is taught, whether commitments to never again are maintained will determine whether the war's suffering produces lasting wisdom or fades into forgotten past, whether its dead are honored through remembrance or dishonored through forgetfulness, whether humanity learns enough from its worst catastrophe to prevent the next. The war's children, babies born during war years, evacuees, orphans, survivors, are now elderly, their memories spanning from war's chaos to post-war recovery to Cold War to present. They bridge generations, connecting war's lived experience to contemporary world, carrying memories forward, bearing witness as combat veterans die. Their perspectives differ from combatants. Children experienced war through fear, confusion, deprivation, disruption, loss, sometimes trauma, but also resilience, adaptation, survival. They remember bombings, evacuation, parents' absence, hunger, fear, but also community solidarity, small kindnesses, moments of normality amid chaos. As adults, they process childhood experiences differently. Some carried trauma, others showed remarkable resilience, most fell somewhere between. Their testimonies add dimensions that combat narratives miss. Home front's reality, civilians' experiences, war's impact on development, family struggles, childhood's loss. As war children age, recording their stories becomes urgent. They are last generation with direct memory, however filtered through childhood's lens. Their passing will complete transition from living memory to history, making preservation efforts critical. War children remind that conflict affects entire societies across generations, that childhood trauma has lasting impacts, that resilience is possible but support matters, that civilians' suffering deserves recognition alongside combatants, that war's costs extend beyond battlefields to disrupted childhoods, broken families, lost potential. Their survival, recovery, contributions to post-war societies demonstrate human resilience, capacity to overcome trauma, build lives after catastrophe. But their struggles, some never fully recovering, carrying pain silently, experiencing effects across lifetimes, remind that survival isn't triumph, that recovery isn't complete, that war's wounds persist across decades. As they pass, gratitude for their testimony, recognition of their experiences, commitment to learning from their wisdom, determination to spare future children similar experiences should accompany remembrance. The war's moral questions defy resolution. Was strategic bombing justified? Were atomic bombs necessary? Could Holocaust have been prevented with earlier intervention? Did ends justify means? When is violence legitimate? What responsibilities do civilians have for government's actions? Can war crimes be justified by necessity? How to balance justice and reconciliation? These questions lack consensus answers. Reasonable people disagree, circumstances matter, moral clarity is elusive. Perhaps the war teaches that moral judgment requires humility, that absolute certainty is dangerous, that acknowledging complexity isn't relativism but wisdom, that some actions are clearly wrong while others involve difficult trade-offs, that intention matters but so do consequences, that preventing greater evil sometimes requires lesser evil, that this doesn't make lesser evil good but makes choices tragic. The war was most justified war in history. Defeating Nazi evil was necessary, yet involved troubling means, bombing cities, using atomic weapons, compromising with Stalin. This tension is uncomfortable but important. It prevents either triumphalism or cynicism, maintains moral seriousness while acknowledging complexity, honors those who fought without glorifying war, recognizes necessity while questioning methods. Perhaps mature understanding requires holding these tensions. The war was both necessary and terrible, just cause and horrific catastrophe, victory and tragedy. This applies beyond the war. Contemporary conflicts also involve moral complexity, trade-offs, tragic choices. Simplistic judgments, either whatever it takes, or violence is never answer. Miss reality's nuance. The war teaches that moral reflection is continuous requirement, that easy answers are usually wrong, that wisdom involves acknowledging difficulty, that choosing well requires thinking carefully about costs, consequences, alternatives, values. These are hard lessons but necessary ones, making us more thoughtful if less certain, more humble if less confident, more aware of complexity if less comfortable with simplicity. The war's shadows lengthen as years pass, 75 years creating distance, perspective, but also forgetting, mythologizing, simplification. Each anniversary sees fewer veterans, survivors, witnesses. Museums update exhibits, historians reassess, filmmakers create new interpretations, educators adapt teaching. The war remains central to understanding modern world. Its institutions, borders, alliances, technologies, values trace to the war's outcomes, decisions, consequences. But relevance evolves. Cold War's end changed the war's meaning. European Union transformed Franco-German enmity, globalization connected former enemies, demographic changes brought new perspectives. Understanding the war requires engaging multiple narratives. Victors and vanquished, combatants and civilians, men and women, adults and children, Europeans and Asians and Africans, resistors and collaborators, survivors and victims. Each perspective adds complexity, challenges simplifications, reveals the war's totality. The war was not single story but millions of stories, each unique, valid, deserving memory. Preserving this multiplicity while maintaining coherent understanding challenges historians, educators, commemorators. But the effort is necessary. Simplified narratives distort, mythologize, serve present purposes rather than honoring past's complexity. The war deserves honest engagement, acknowledging horror without despair, recognizing heroism without romanticism, learning lessons without imposing pat answers. remembering suffering while maintaining hope, honoring dead through wisdom, not war. As living memory ends, responsibility intensifies. To preserve accurately what happened, teach thoughtfully why it matters, apply appropriately what it teaches, ensure that 70 million deaths, immeasurable suffering, catastrophic destruction weren't meaningless, that the war's legacy is wisdom, not just warning, that remembering prevents repetition, that the past informs future, that those who survived, those who didn't, those who fought, those who endured, those who resisted, those who suffered, all are remembered, not just commemorated, learned from, not just honored, that their war, humanity's war, the war remains present in consciousness, relevant to choices, meaningful to living, connected to present through understanding, not just memory. Close your eyes. The smoke has cleared, the guns silent, the bombs fallen, the soldiers home or buried, the survivors old or gone. You are no longer in the rubble of Berlin, the ashes of Hiroshima, the liberated camps, the victorious streets. You are here, now, in your bed, in the darkness of your room, in the peace so many died to give you. Feel your pillow beneath your head, the blanket's weight, the quiet around you. The war is over, has been for 75 years. Yet it lives in the world you inhabit, the peace you enjoy, the lessons still unlearned, the warnings still unheeded, the questions still unanswered. If these whispered histories moved you, please subscribe to Whispered Empires and press the bell so we can continue exploring time's shadows together. And leave a like so others might find their way here, might remember, might learn, might understand. Now rest. Let the weight of history settle. Let the dead find peace in your remembrance. Let the living find wisdom in their stories. The war is past. You are safe. You are here. Sleep now and dream of the world those who fought hoped we would build. Just peaceful, free, remembered. Sleep,